Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 3, our final day of the NIHHIS National Meeting. Before we begin, I just want to give a quick overview of the platform. Again, we will be using Zoom for Government, and as attendees, you will have access to the Q&A function. There will be a few spaces throughout our meeting today where you will be able to ask questions to our panelists, and even if they do not have time to answer in real time, they may be able to message you directly to answer your question. The chat function also allows attendees to message the hosts and panelists if you're having any difficulty with the platform. Additionally, if you want to watch our ASL interpreters, make sure to pin the interpreters to your screen. We will also have closed captions as well. And we will be live streaming this meeting to our YouTube channel in real time, and we'll also be recording our meeting. The recordings will be available on heat.gov as well as the National Integrated Heat Health Information System YouTube page. And thank you so much for attending our meeting, and I'm going to turn it over to Paul and Kim to officially kick us off.
Great, thanks, Morgan, and welcome everyone to the third and final day of the NIHHIS National Meeting. For those who weren't able to attend yesterday's session, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. One is that there were several presentations and discussion about the disproportionate impacts that heat has on some people and communities. We really heard stories and saw the human face of this issue. For example, we heard about mental health impacts, about effects of urban heat islands on local communities, impacts on farm workers, how people with disabilities are affected, and some stories of clinical cases that physicians are experiencing. So health equity and environmental justice are really critical aspects of our planning and response to heat. Through both the Justice 40 initiative and the forthcoming National Heat Strategy, all federal agencies are ensuring that our heat work focuses on the populations that are most affected. We also had some discussion yesterday on cascading impacts. We know that heat waves don't occur in a vacuum. Just for example, they can and do occur at the same time as wildfires, and federal response and recovery efforts can address this. We heard in the opening remarks that FEMA can respond to power outages during heat waves, for example. And this really will be a collaborative effort, both in terms of cross-federal collaboration and working with community partners, health departments, clinicians, and local emergency responders. There was a lot more discussed yesterday and over the past 2 days. And as Morgan mentioned, the recordings are all available if you missed any of that. So I'll now turn it over to Kim McMahon to talk about some communication efforts and set us up for today's agenda.
Thank you, Paul. So as Paul mentioned, we have a lot of communication efforts going on, and I hope some of you who are attending today were able to join us for our coffee session yesterday morning, where we got to talk about a communication strategy that we have developed across federal agencies. And it really started with understanding agencies' roles and responsibilities, as well as getting partner feedback, understanding what their challenges are, what their needs are, how federal agencies can help, and then what are we planning to do across agencies and individually in 2024 to really increase the awareness of heat, the dangers of heat, the resources available to individuals and communities, and what people can do to protect themselves from heat, not just in an impending heat wave, but for years to come and across timescales. So a couple of things that I want to mention that we have going into this federal heat communication strategy in and engaging our non-federal partners is that we have a social media campaign coming up April 29th through May 3rd. So we'll be having a different theme or focus for each of those days, and we'll be using hashtag NIHHIS, hashtag heat safety. So please join along with us in helping to just reinforce and amplify the messaging to prepare communities for heat. We also have a number of interagency webinars, which you can stay up to date on heat.gov when those are coming. And we're making improvements to heat.gov. We're expanding information on the populations that are at higher risk, those disproportionately impacted. So lots of activities, and really hoping to help energize and keep the energy from NIHHIS National moving things forward. And speaking of moving forward, I want to highlight the theme today is community heat resilience. And we are going to have a keynote address, which I won't go too much into detail because Julie's going to introduce our keynote speaker. But then we'll hear from our chief heat officers from Miami-Dade County and the state of Arizona. And then we'll keep the talk going about keeping indoor spaces safe, such as workplace, schools, and homes. So where you work, where you live, where you recreate. And then after our break, we'll come back and talk about heat policy. Again, resilient housing solutions. So we'll have some incredible speakers from HUD, from Montgomery County Green Bank, community of tenants, and we have our partners at NRDC helping to facilitate that and moderate that. And then we will be ending our day on innovating cooling solutions. So very, very exciting day, lots to talk about. I'm going to stop there because I think we're one other thing I wanted to mention, that while NIHHIS is the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, and that N stands for national, we do work in some international heat items as well. And in a national scale, we are working with partners such as the Global Heat Health Information Network. So I just wanted to throw that in there, that while we haven't been able to go in depth in the past 2 days, keep in mind that what we are discussing does have international implications as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Julie.
That was perfect. Thank you, Kim, and welcome back, everyone. I'm Julie Turton, one of the NIHHIS co-chairs and lead, and I am, as Kim said, honored to be introducing our guest speaker today. So I just want to reinforce the fact that NIHHIS is actually domestically focused, but we learn a lot from working with other countries. And we also, through our State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development, and a lot of our companies and industry that we support in the U.S., do have an interest in both the development work and, doing business and commerce internationally. So there is an international component to the National Heat Strategy. And USAID has recently, recognized more formally its role in heat, and has just had a big global heat summit, and is beginning to do the same kind of thing, engaging the non-federal community and funding community and donors in heat work. So I will say that the reason we didn't address international explicitly is because that is a whole other day or two, and we will be doing that in probably late May or mid-June with some of the agencies I mentioned, and hopefully some of you as well. So this is our amazing way to really highlight some of the key issues that we need to be addressing a little bit more robustly within NIHHIS and within our international community on heat and peace and conflict and security. So I am really pleased to introduce to you today Dr. Tegan Blaine. She is the director of the program on climate, environment, and conflict at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Prior to joining the U.S. Institute for Peace, she served as a vice president on a climate initiative at the National Geographic Society, and then led the climate change team at USAID's Africa Bureau, worked on climate change and international development at McKinsey & Company, served as a policy advisor on water at the U.S. Department of State, and, as if that wasn't enough, taught math and physics as a Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania. So she has an amazing background that she brings to this job, and we are just really thrilled that you're willing to spend some time with us and impart sort of where you think and where the Institute of Peace is looking at this intersection of heat and conflict, both domestic. We heard some great talks yesterday on mental health and conflict and heat. So I think it ties in nicely if you're bringing more of an international perspective to that whole thing. So Dr. Blaine, thank you very much for being here, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Julie. And it's really wonderful to have a chance to talk with all of you today. I used to be able to work on climate change and heat issues in my former life at USAID, and I haven't had a chance to interact with this kind of community in a little while. And so it's wonderful to be back in this community. Would you mind advancing the slide? Thanks so much. First off, I did want to say that I am at the U.S. Institute of Peace. We are a national, nonpartisan, independent institution that is founded by Congress, and so we are closely linked to the U.S. government. And we are working on the proposition that a world without conflict is possible and that we can actually do something to mitigate the risks of violent conflict. You might ask why heat matters to us, but for a lot of the work that we are currently doing, thinking about how human development and issues that hit individuals really matters when we're thinking about peace and security issues, because the experience that people have at a very human level is directly tied to social movements and how people interact with government and where conflict has its roots. And so hopefully I can give you some exposure today into how we think about some of these issues in the international context and how they play into peace and security issues. Next slide, please. So I know over the last couple of days, you've been talking a lot about how heat manifests. And what we see in the international space is not very different than what we're seeing in the domestic space. The number of days with extreme heat is rising. You've probably seen some of these numbers already from some of the domestic cities as well as international cities. Also important is that temperature at night is going up when things normally cool down. And so when temperatures don't cool, it impacts human beings on a whole variety of levels, both as individuals and our own experience of heat, but also playing out in terms of agricultural output. Some plants don't germinate if temperatures stay too high. And so heat has dramatic impacts, not just on the personal experience of heat, but how our lives are set up and the resources that we depend on. Next slide, please. I'm sure that you have talked a lot over the last few days about the direct impacts of heat on death. And I'm showing you here some data from Pakistan over the last 20 years so that you can see how, as temperature increases, the average mortality due to heat also increases. We've also experienced heat waves with significant impact in the United States in the last couple of years, but also internationally. The European heat wave of 2003 was responsible for more than 70,000 excess deaths. We regularly see excessive heat events in India and Pakistan, where many thousands of people can be impacted at once. In Russia, just 10 years ago, a heat wave killed over 55,000 people, and that's in a country that we think of as a relatively cool country. And so this is absolutely critical from an international perspective as well as a domestic perspective. Within the next decade or so, it's likely that 4 billion people are going to be experiencing major heat waves, which is an enormous number of people to be exposed to the kinds of heat impacts that we are going to see. Now, I know that Dr. Robin Cooper discussed yesterday the range of physical impacts on sleep and insomnia, cognition, mood, how mental illness manifests in hot conditions, and heat exacerbates other health conditions. But heat has other impacts. In Africa, for example, roads melt on hot days. They actually melt. And so in places like Ethiopia, the melting of the road impacts transportation and the ability to move around the country. It impacts the amount of money that you have to spend on maintaining roads, for example. And there are all of these secondary impacts that aren't just immediately clear at first glance. But as I'm sure you've also discussed yesterday, heat isn't just an increase in temperature. Hotter air holds more water, and so you often get a combination of increasing heat and an increase in humidity. Especially in places like Africa, this can significantly change the patterns of things like vector-borne diseases and change the entire health landscape for entire societies. So heat manifests in a variety of different ways that eventually add up to people's experience of their own personal security. Next slide, please. Now, I suspect that you have also been talking about the linkages between heat and violence over the last couple of days. A recent survey of 68 studies showed that a standard deviation in temperature led to about a 1% increase in self-harm, a 2% increase for interpersonal conflict, and a 6% increase in intergroup conflict. But the question is, what does that actually mean for societies? Could you go to the next slide, please? This is data from across the developing world that looks very kind of at as small geographies and then expands outward and looks at the linkages between temperature and violence. The first plot on the left looks at the linkages between increases of temperature and violence in East Africa. And you can see that as temperature goes up, there's a very, very strong correlation to local violence. But it's not just local. These kinds of things really add up into societal-wide and country-wide impacts. The second plot shows the linkages between the increase of temperature and the incidence of civil war. And this, for me, is very personal at the moment, because when we talk about Africa, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, we have seen several countries that have experienced coups, primarily in the Sahelian region of Africa over the last few years. And so it begs the question of how heat is contributing to the likeliness of coups in those areas of the world that already are starting from very hot temperatures. And then the third plot gives an idea of what's going on across the entire tropical region of the world. And again, shows the pattern that the first two plots showed, that as temperature goes up, we see civil conflict and unrest also increase all across the world. Next slide, please. This has real consequences. Just to put it in different terms, a 1% increase in temperature leads to a 4.5% increase in civil war in the same year. There is a direct correlation between a change in temperature and what happens between a government and its citizens in that same year. And then also by the year 2030, we are looking at a potential increase of 54% in armed conflict in the Africa region. Now, it's necessary to say that all of these kinds of things are happening in the context of societies. They're happening in the context of places where governance may be weak, where there aren't necessarily strong institutions to organize a response to to extreme heat, where people don't have access to air conditioning and other ways to mitigate the consequences of heat. But these things begin to add up. What's happening at the individual level has societal impacts and countrywide impacts. Next slide, please. It's also likely that in the future, heat is going to drive migration. In the climate change space, we're very cognizant of the fact that the world is changing in ways that are likely to drive people's movements. And at the base level, we assume that that's a good thing. It's a valid adaptation to changing environmental conditions. But when we start looking at the scale of displacement and migration that is likely to take place over the next couple of decades, it becomes a much scarier reality. There's recent research that basically shows that only about less than 1% of the world where there is human society are places where the mean annual temperature really isn't amenable to human society. But by 2070, it's likely that about 20% of what is currently civilized areas of the world are likely to be at temperatures that are not really amenable for life as we know it. And that will affect likely about 30% of the global population. If you look at the colored plot, you can see where those increases in temperature are going to be most significant. Areas that jump out at me are the entire northern part of Africa, the Middle East, the area in India and Pakistan, areas in Latin America, for example. That means that a lot of people are going to be on the move. Some of those people will have the resources to move easily. Some of those people are going to begin by just looking for ways to move to cities for seasonal experiences, for example, to find ways to supplement income, which is going down where they actually live because of agricultural failures or others. And they will rotate in and out on a seasonal basis, looking for other opportunities and then returning home at various times. Other people may be forced to abandon their homes. Many of those people are ending up in urban areas. And although urban growth in places like the United States tends to be very strongly linked with economic growth, that is not so true in other areas of the world. In those kinds of places, we're seeing that many of the people who move are ending up in kind of the peri-urban areas or outside urban areas, which are vulnerable to environmental issues like flooding and landslides, where they don't necessarily have access to a lot of the services that cities provide, like jobs, like education, like health services, like access to water, access to housing, access to transportation. All of those things tend to be much more tenuous in the marginal places where people are ending up. And so something like heat is likely to have significant ramifications, not just for individual lives, but for the stability of urban areas, for example, and the stability of countries. So heat by itself is a problem that we will need to tackle where it has direct ramifications on human health, but it is also a societal issue where it complicates all sorts of problems that are inherent in many developing and poorer countries in particular. Next slide, please. I wanted to show you something that I developed about a year ago, just to explain to the president of the institute where I work how climate-related shocks and stresses result in the kinds of conflict and security issues that an institute like the U.S. Institute of Peace actually cares about. When we think about heat, for example, we think about the likelihood of extreme events and rising temperatures and how those drive migration and displacement. But they're also happening in the context of a whole variety of social factors, things like population growth, social inequality, how well states can respond to the stresses that people are under, and whether they can come in to provide emergency services when people need them. There are also issues related to socioeconomic development. Do people have the education and the access to different kinds of career paths and livelihoods and so on? What we see is that climate-related shocks and stresses, and heat is an important part of that, results in significant human insecurity issues, food insecurity, water insecurity, health insecurity. It also relates or tends to result in grievances against governments, which are not able to deliver the services that people need. It results in things like resource competition, as some of those resources are affected by heat and other climate-related variables as well. And all of these add up, not just into things like migration and displacement and political unrest, but we also see things like recruitment to violent and extremist groups, many of which in Africa, where I've spent the majority of my career, cross borders as easily as anything else. They don't have borders. And so when you think about what's happening in a country like Mali, it impacts all of the countries around and impacts the entire region. We also look at things like intergroup tensions and violence, and we look at things like transboundary tensions over, for example, changing river flows and how those can play into regional and geopolitical tensions. These are the kinds of issues that security institutions worry about. So when we think of heat in the short run, we're often thinking about how it plays into international development issues. But those international development issues and what's going on at a community level and at an individual level add up to societal impacts and then to international impacts. And many of these translate not just into security issues within many countries overseas, but also security issues specifically for the United States. Last slide, please. So more than anything, the message that I'd like to leave you with is while we're preparing for a hotter future domestically, we also need to be thinking about what's going on internationally, not just for the good of societies around the world, but also in terms of the US security interests in what's happening around the rest of the world and how it could affect us in the United States. There are the direct health impacts that have been discussed over the last couple of days and impacts on workforce and so on. There are issues related to interpersonal and domestic violence and conflict. There are impacts, indirect ones perhaps, or second order ones on natural resources and critical infrastructure, including healthcare. But then we need to think about how food, water, and health insecurity add up to livelihood insecurity for people around the world. All of this results in destabilizing impacts that include increasing distrust in government, fueling riots and political instability, and even civil wars that have the potential to spill over borders. Increased recruitment to violent and extremist groups that can destabilize entire regions. Displacement and migration, some of which, if managed well, can be very positive, but when it's not managed, could be incredibly destabilizing, and transboundary regional and geopolitical conflict. I don't mean to scare anybody with this kind of concluding slide, but I do think it's important to recognize that heat is not just a domestic problem. It has significant ramifications for the entire world and ramifications that will come back to haunt us in terms of our own domestic security. I'll stop there, Julie, and hand it back to you.
Tegan, those were amazing comments. Thank you also on behalf of the interpreters. You spoke slowly. We all forget to do that for them, but really amazing content for us and an important message for us all to hear. We have just a minute for a question or two if people want to add it, but I don't see anything. So I'm going to ask you one. We had this chat as we were talking about developing this, and what do you see as some of the things that we can be doing to help really, partly raise awareness that within countries who are having trouble just getting through a month a day, a year, let alone long-term instability, and also on the research and, opportunity of advancing solution side? Any thoughts on either or both of those pathways?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most critical issues right now is actually prediction related. How do we come up with early warning systems and really begin to provide some of the data that countries can use to respond to this? Without the data, without kind of some foreknowledge, it's really difficult to plan a response and be able to do a response. And functioning governance is such an amazing part of that. We really rely on government systems that are functioning, that are able to be responsive to data, able to plan in advance, and so on. But the other thing is that these are really complex human systems where heat drives an enormous number of impacts within the context of very complex societies. And it's very difficult to say that this drives this, that drives this. We can't necessarily follow those causal pathways cleanly. It does make doing research very complex, and it also makes figuring out what the best ways of addressing some of these issues are. And I do think that a lot more research needs to be done in this area to help us piece together what are some of the most important drivers of conflict related to heat, and to think about how that feeds into fragile societies in particular, and how we can be more responsive.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and a really good answer, and a challenge, actually, not really an answer, but a challenge to all of us, I think. And by the way, I did not pay her to say anything about early warnings yesterday, on day one. We were to say a little bit about what our agencies were, so I put on my NOAA hat. It's like, we're the forecasting people. But I think globally, really, where are those high risk areas, and how do heat overlays a lot of those different angles, and you laid that out so beautifully for us, all the way from planning and preparing and helping those countries at highest risk who might be most fragile, helps figure out where to invest resources and time. Also helps us figure out where to put research dollars and where to invest in building the prediction systems, the models, the data collection on all the many aspects of livelihoods, and even mental health and well-being, which is a very hard thing to quantify. But I think you, from my perspective, left us with a really great charge about how important it is to understand heat in the context of society, its global impact in other countries, and also how that affects us even back home and our own interests abroad. So I think whether you're concerned from a US perspective, a global perspective, or a human perspective, you laid it out beautifully for us, Tegan, and I want to say thank you very much for your time and for joining us today. We will be following up again with a much deeper dive on a lot of these international issues later in May, early June. We haven't set the date yet. So I hope that you will continue to engage with us as we sort this out. And we look forward to doing that with many of you on the call today, and probably some of you who are not on the call working on international space. So Tegan, thank you so much. And really appreciate you bringing your perspectives, your background, and the Institute of Peace to the table here.
Thank you all as well, and all the best for the rest of the day.
Thank you. All right, so this is my scale day, right? We're going from international. I'm at the federal level, but I am really, really honored to be transitioning a little bit now to more of a fireside chat kind of thing with our state and local perspective on heat. So this is really a great honor. I'm kind of the sandwich in between. We've heard a lot about the federal stuff, so I'm eager to hear from this panel here. One of the things I will say about how this panel evolved, that we set up NIHHIS National, the first one 3 years ago, as one of the ways in which we want to engage with our non-federal community, international NGOs, private sector, state, local, tribal, territorial governments, you name it, regular citizens. And so we continue to evolve NIHHIS National. And one of the things that we hope to do over the next year and over the summer through some of the regional engagements you've been hearing about, we'll talk about that again at the end, but we really want to encourage state, local, tribal, territorial communities, citizens, families to do your own heat planning. And we hope that on day 3 of NIHHIS Nationals in the future, that we'll have a discussion among all of you about what your plans are and what you're doing and how we can learn from each other. But we thought a really good way to start off that kind of goal of getting everybody to be able to answer the question is, what's your heat plan? It doesn't matter if you're a state level government, you're Miami-Dade County, or you're a household, what's your heat plan? So next year, we want to be able to set that up and hear from a lot of you. But we thought a great way to get this kicked off is to hear from a couple of people whose job it is to actually answer that question. So we are really thrilled to have with us two folks today, and this will be a bit of an interactive dialogue here. We have Eugene Livar, who is the first ever state chief heat officer for Arizona. He's only been in this job, I don't know, a month and a half. I had the opportunity to spend a little time with him last week. So he's new in the job, but not new to health and not new to heat. He actually oversees the implementation of Governor Hobbs in Arizona's extreme heat preparedness plan. He began his public health work at the Arizona Department of Health Services in 2012 as an epidemiologist assisting with state efforts covering border health and unexplained deaths, which I had to ask him what that meant. So that's a whole side chat you should have with him sometime. And then prior to his current role as a state chief heat officer, he held roles as healthcare associated infections program manager, office chief of the Disease Integration and Services Division, the bureau chief of epidemiology and disease control, and assistant director of public health preparedness. I will say, and I can attest to this, that his forward-thinking approach and commitment to public health in this heat space really will serve Arizona residents well, help shape policies and initiatives really to reduce the heat risks across the table, and especially for those most vulnerable to heat. So we are thrilled to have Eugene. Please go ahead and turn on your camera. And we will also be honored to hear from Jane Gilbert. She is the chief heat officer of Miami-Dade County. Not very many counties and only one state have a chief heat officer, but there is a network of chief heat officers growing around the world. Jane's been a part of this since its inception. She is the chief heat officer for Miami-Dade County. She works across departments and with many partners to address the increasing risks to human health and economic burdens associated with extreme heat. Immediately before that, Ms. Gilbert served as City of Miami's first chief resilience officer for 4 years. So it was a great transition for her to be the chief heat officer. Before local government, she served as Miami Foundation's agenda, managed Miami Foundation's agenda on sea level rise, Wells Fargo's community affairs in South Florida, and served as the executive director for 3 nonprofits in Greater Miami. So she certainly knows Miami, and she knows a wide variety of institutional constructs and approaches. So without further ado, let me just welcome you both to day 3 of NIHHIS National and see if we can just get a few conversations going here. I have some questions for you. Welcome, both of you. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure. Good to see you, Julie. Good to see you.
You too. All right. So, and for the audience, I'm going to ask a few questions here, but we do want you to have, this is an interactive thing. So I'm going to get the ball rolling here, but we'll be taking questions from the audience, and we'll have to filter a little bit if they come in really hard, but we might get some tough questions, but we will be also forwarding the questions that you ask. We might not be able to get to all of them, but we will be taking questions. So as they come up, drop them in the Q&A part of the chat, please. All right, so let me just give you guys both the floor. Maybe we'll start with Jane because you've been at it a little bit longer. What is your role as a chief heat officer? What do you actually do? And how did the role come about? Why is it important?
Yeah. Thank you. It is such an honor to be on this part of this national summit here today. So the chief heat officer, what the mayor charged me, our mayor is Daniela Levine Cava, with doing is to address the increasing health and economic risks associated with extreme heat here in Miami-Dade County. And to do that across departments within the county, as well as in partnership with many of our external partners and stakeholders. We looked at the risks, worked with various partners on developing a plan, and now we're implementing that plan. The role came about, Miami's known internationally for our risks to sea level rise and hurricane risks, and we've been working on those, mitigating those risks for quite some time. But in 2020, a series of nonprofit organizations got together to do a series of focus groups and surveys throughout Miami-Dade County, but particularly focusing on our most vulnerable communities to find out what people were most concerned about as it relates to climate change. And ironically, it was not sea level rise. It was not even hurricanes. It was extreme heat, because that's what people were living day in and day out, the impacts of. Additionally, we had been part of an international effort led by the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center on extreme heat. And it was really out of conversations with them that the idea of having a person who is not siloed in one department, but looking across departments and across partners in the impacts of extreme heat and how to address it. And that's really how the Chief Heat Officer title and position was created.
Get myself off of mute. Yeah, thank you, Jane. Yeah, it's a really important thing to note, your comment about how this was self-identified almost as a priority, which is really important, especially for cities that are already hot. You know, when we first started this 15 years ago, we're like, yeah, it's already hot here, you know, whatever, exactly. You go deal with that heat thing someplace else. So Eugene, how did your position come to be, and what do you want to do with your new role at the state level?
Thank you for the question, Julie. I think there's some commonalities between how my position came about and also with Jane's position on that end too. You know, as we've heard throughout this event, the summer of 2023 was the hottest ever recorded in Arizona, and temperatures have been rising in duration and severity, resulting in annual increases of heat-caused and heat-related deaths and illnesses in our state. So due to this, Governor Hobbs issued an executive order directing her administration to plan and prepare for future extreme heat events. And so the Arizona Extreme Heat Preparedness Plan was developed and established, and it also identified the Chief Heat Officer position and role within that report that came out in that plan. So as the Chief Heat Officer, my role is to oversee the implementation of Governor Hobbs' plan and work to coordinate with partnerships between state, local municipalities, communities, the private sector, community-based organizations, and others. And this will require working really closely with the Governor's Office of Resiliency and with Director Marion Mahoney and other state agencies moving forward. So I hope to utilize my preparedness background and experience to look at ways to standardize processes, streamline communications, hear and assist state partners, and then bring centering presence before, during, and after heat season.
It almost sounded like a FEMA plan before, during, and after. You know, we've heard that.
The preparedness side of me comes out every now and then.
It did. It just crept out there. Actually, I wanted to acknowledge, yes, that was a nod to you, Nick. I did want to acknowledge, though, that you are in the public health department, and ask you, this isn't really on the core question list, so I'm going a little bit off script, but I think it's easy for you to answer, but it's important. There's a difference between an emergency response for heat wave and public health planning. And sometimes it's been our experience from looking in that the public health and emergency response don't always connect. And I wonder if you could speak to a little bit about that, maybe both of you, and then if you want to tie into what are you most concerned about. But I really think that connection between emergency response and public preparedness and planning, if you could speak to that, maybe both of you, because that's something we struggle with at the federal level. Who needs what resources and at what level and what scale? So I would love to hear from both of you on that. Sorry for the road question.
I can start if that's okay. Just kind of from my perspective, I think I was really lucky to be in the position of Assistant Director of Public Health Preparedness for a couple of years before going into this position that I have now as Chief Heat Officer. I think, you know, I can just make some comparisons from our experiences that we had during COVID and other biological and environmental events. It was within public health and our preparedness umbrella that often has that engagement with our Department of Emergency and Military Affairs, which is our other side of the state emergency operations center, while we handle the health emergency operations center under the public health umbrella. So we were really lucky that we have a good relationship between our two sister agencies within the state of Arizona and work very well together within those type of events. And then we often see a crossover with those environmental, be it wildfires, be it heat, be it other events where that partnership comes into play. And we see that coordination happen and move forward. So I think it's really important as much as possible to establish those relationships, those communication lines, and be familiar with each other. That way you can work really closely together, have that familiarity, know who to go to with questions and where to get responses and where to find those partnerships. And one thing to always remember between the two houses of emergency management and public health, when you're looking at those two sides, is that we're all in this for the best reason possible, is to have a good positive outcome for our state. And keeping that in mind, keeping positive intent in mind, and just making sure that you over communicate and have a listening ear within those partnerships always seems to work out well.
Great advice, Eugene. Thank you for that. Really makes a lot of sense. Jane, I know you have also managed and navigated this for years, even as a chief resilience officer before being the chief heat officer. Could you speak a little bit to that connection between emergency response preparedness and public health and long-term planning?
Yeah, and I have the advantage of the emergency manager from the city of Miami is now in the county, so we get to work together really well. But yeah, one of the things we did early on was work with them and our National Weather Service on updating heat advisory and warning thresholds and updating the heat response protocols when I first came in, making sure heat was part of our hazard mitigation plan, which it had not been prior. But Miami, our biggest challenge is chronic high heat and humidity. It's less episodic. Our main risks for an episodic event are if we had a widespread and extended power outage. So we work together with emergency management, certainly for our response protocols for those heat advisories and warnings. But our heat advisory doesn't start until a heat index of 105. We have risks well below that. So, and I know Eugene has the same in Arizona, well below their heat advisory and warning thresholds. So we have to do that preventative public education and outreach throughout our heat season and trainings and preparedness. And we work very closely with emergency management, creating those, updating our CERT volunteer trainings, and which is Citizen Emergency Response Team volunteers. That is a long time program through FEMA. And we've added heat safety training. We're now doing what we're calling trifecta training for our heat season starts May 1st, flood season starts May 15th, hurricane season starts June 1st. So we're preparing our community disaster volunteers for that all hazards approach.
I laugh because it's a great analogy. It's sad that you have to do that, but I'm glad to know how that's working. I'm sure others will also be following suit. We've got some good questions coming in. I'm going to ask you one more that gives you a little bit of chance to talk about what you're most concerned about and what you want, coming up. What are the big concerns you have, and what do you want people to know about heat in your community, or maybe wisdom from your learning that you want them to know about how they manage it?
You want me to start, Eugene?
Sure, whichever.
Yeah, go ahead, Jane.
All right. Well, in terms of what am I most concerned about, I think of like the who, where, when. It's really in doing our vulnerability analysis in the county. We looked at the zip codes that had and what the rates of heat-related emergency department visits and hospitalizations were by zip code and what the top correlating factors were. And it was high poverty rates, high land surface temperatures, high percentage of outdoor workers, high numbers of families with children. That's really, and the disparity is significant. The zip codes we're focusing on are visiting the hospital 4 and 5 times the rates of other zip codes in Miami-Dade County. And so we know where we need, it's not the people who are working in AC and traveling in their car in AC and are able to afford their AC at home, but it's those who can't afford to keep cool at home. It's those that work outside every day. It's those that have to walk and wait at a bus stop very long and can't plan when they do that. Those are the people that we need to be most concerned about. So that's the where is, in playgrounds. And then the when I mentioned earlier, the biggest risk for all is if we had a widespread and extended power outage during a high heat time. So that's, and then what I want people to know is these are preventable. With good training, with knowledge, with good practices, we can prevent these heat-related illnesses, injuries, deaths, all of that. It's highly preventable. A lot of opportunities out there with the Biden administration right now to help keep cool affordably at home through increased funding for weatherization programs and LIHEAP and tax credits and energy rebates. All of these can help people keep cool at home. And just the message to employers is that I firmly believe that by keeping your employees healthy and safe, you can maintain productivity and reduce your workman's comp claims. I don't think employers fully appreciate the number of injuries, people falling off a ladder, having an injury with a tool because they're not fully present because of the heat. And so I think that is something, these simple water shaded rest breaks protocols can make a huge difference on their workers' health and safety, but also their bottom line.
Yeah, good point, Jane. The bottom line piece is, I think, something we have to work on communicating. There is a question about communication in the chat here, which will follow on. But Eugene, I want you to have a chance to answer, what you're most concerned about and what do you want people to know about heat? And then we'll get to a communications question in here.
Sure. I think for the state of Arizona and in my position, I really had to pull back and just take a look at the whole state. And, most concerning to me is the exponential increase in preventable. And once again, that word preventable, heat-related illnesses and deaths. Preliminary data in Arizona show that 44% of deaths last year occurred in people who had lived in Arizona for 20 years or more. I think so often we hear in our state that it's a dry heat or that we're used to the heat on that end, and we can't be complacent about that. We're all vulnerable to its effects, and we need to make sure that we can communicate that out, along with specific communication for other groups that we have concerns about and that are vulnerable. I think another concern in my new role is how can we avoid the siloing of efforts? There have been amazing local grassroots efforts happening for years in Arizona, but we need to have a statewide vision, awareness, and attention across the board to all urban, rural, and tribal communities within our states. Plus, we need to ensure a culture of collaboration and best practices because so many good efforts are happening across the state. And how can we share that, share templates, share efforts and outcomes so that others can benefit from that? Because we see so much going on within our state. I think also we know heat-related illness and deaths are preventable, as mentioned. So we want to ensure Arizonans know the signs and symptoms and check in with their loved ones during heat season. A really simple check-in just to make sure everybody is doing well. We can all be good neighbors by doing that as we go forward from this point on during heat season. And also make sure that you're hydrating the day before you will be in the heat. Or basically in Arizona, that's every day from this point forward during this rest of this year. And I think also moving forward, and it's reflected quite nicely in messaging that we distribute, like many others here today, we try to stick to some core messaging to make it easy to understand how to move forward. So we always mention to stay safe and healthy, stay cool, stay informed, stay hydrated, and be sunwise. And we try to be consistent with that messaging across the board.
While I've got you really on the hook for that, there's one message specifically on effective methods to reach, inform, and check on isolated community members. We know we've seen studies, even not that you need a study to say this, but certainly those social cohesion plays a huge part in preventing deaths. Are there any things, and Eugene, I'll let you take the first stab, and then Jane for you, that are some of your most vulnerable and disproportionately affected populations? Who are they? And B, what are some of those ways, how, if other communities want to do this, what are some things that actually work? So first is, what are the populations that might be most unique and most vulnerable for you or disproportionately affected? And then a little bit on the communications, like what do you actually do?
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I think regardless of the community that we're talking about, I think it's working really closely with community-based organizations and those who have boots on the ground that are able to do that outreach and make sure that they have the infrastructure and the support to do that good work that they're doing every day. And I think when we're looking at those impacted populations, I think we're looking at persons experiencing homelessness within Arizona. Just of note, our most populous county, Maricopa County, it was reported in 2023, I think that about 45% of their about 650 heat-related deaths were among persons experiencing homelessness. So a very impacted group there. Persons working outdoors, like Jane had just mentioned on that end, and older adults. And I think when we're working with those community-based organizations, local health authorities, and others, you really want to have a multimodal, multilingual communication campaign to make sure that you can get the message out and it can be understood by those who need to hear it or see it. And then you need to make sure that it's in languages that can be understood. It may be nonverbal, it may be infographic. You need to really look at those options. And you may also have items within tribal communities where you need to make sure that it is a radio ad may have more impact than other types of reach out, social media, and other pieces on those ends. So I think, it's really looking at some of those top tier communities that need to get those communications. And you need to also do a self-assessment of what's the best way to go out and get that communication out there. I think we learned one thing from our recent response efforts with COVID and other items is, doom and gloom does not work well within the community. We need to have good positive messaging. We need to lean on each other and our empathy for others to be able to check on neighbors and your loved ones and to be out there in the community and have good community practices.
Great words of wisdom. Jane, what have you done? Well, first of all, what populations are some of your most disproportionately affected and about whom you're most concerned in Miami-Dade? And what have been some of the successful communications or things that you think you're working on that we need to do better on communicating, especially to reach those most underserved? And
yeah. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about having identified some of the zip codes and demographics and the fact that they're urban heat islands, et cetera. So we target our heat season campaign, and it is multilingual. It's in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole to those zip codes, to those demographics, through the radio stations they listen to, outdoor media, bus stops, bus shelter ads, gas station, health clinics, where we try to get to where people are as much as possible, and as Eugene mentioned, the languages they speak. Eugene mentioned the unhoused population. That is also an area of concern. We don't have as high as Maricopa County population, but it is still a concerning group. So I just actually this week did a training for all our outreach workers to people experiencing homeless that we last year worked with them on donations of cooling towels and cooling gaiters and water. And so they were providing that outreach and helping people get to cooling sites. And so I was getting feedback on that experience and what supplies work the best for them to be equipped, but also provide them with the training of what are the signs to notice. How do you get someone to recover from heat exhaustion? When do you need to call 911 and get medical attention? We do the same with our community disaster volunteers. And those, to Eugene's point, we do that outreach in partnership with our community-based partners so that it's people from those communities that are, leaders of leaders to be that buddy system, really know who's vulnerable in their own neighborhood and have the tools to both help prevent illnesses, but also respond if someone's experiencing it.
Great. The community-based organizations and the local trusted voices, and that's why I'm I know for the federal side, we can do some things, but really especially with heat, everything is so local, and some of the things are really just so unique to the trusted population and the most vulnerable folks and all. So really, you're to hear this. Jane, a quick question for you, a technical one. Question in the chat was, do you use zip codes on place of living or place of work, or both? Probably both.
It's the place of living. Now, so in Deep South Data is our agricultural section, and that had the highest rates of hospital visits. It's where people are living and working, really, but in terms of the records we used is where people live.
Okay. Got some great questions coming in. Let me just last ask though. I'll give you a one at the close here about your vision for the future, but I do want to give you a chance to talk, if you haven't already, some of the events for the upcoming heat season, and then we have some data questions and some cooling center questions in the chat that I want to raise for you. So we're kind of going back and forth. So Jane, why don't you talk about anything you've got planned for the upcoming heat season? You've already talked about some of the training you've done, so I don't know if there's anything else you want to add and highlight, because remember, we are also using you as guinea pigs to showcase what's possible. So as other communities are thinking about doing this, even if they don't have a chief heat officer, what might they do? So what does your season look like, and how do you plan for the summer? And also, what are you doing for longer term planning?
Yeah. So we kick off our heat season officially May 1st. It runs May 1st to October 31st. As the lead up to that, we're starting to do trainings, as I mentioned earlier. I have a series of trainings coming up for summer camp providers because a lot of kids outdoors playing, and the workers themselves are at risk. So doing a series of those, including on our heat season kickoff day, to about 400 of those providers across the county, and then also to our business community on our Collaborative Resilience Summit on May 1st. But so that heat season, multilingual, multi-channel campaign will run. We front load it starting now and run it very much harder in the first few months of the heat season, because that's when you have the most heat-related illnesses, and it's the time to get the education going. And then it sort of is just a softer message as we get into September and October. But and then we've been working with our emergency management, homeless outreach partners and cooling site partners on just ensuring we have everybody ready for heat advisories and warnings and how to respond during those times.
Got it. Eugene, anything you haven't talked about? What does your heat season look like, and both the summer and the planning for future ones?
Of course, Julie. I appreciate the question. And I think within the state of Arizona, we're kind of leaning on the communication and awareness piece. And that's all going to kick off for us starting on Heat Awareness Week, starting May 6th here in Arizona. So we're going to be coordinating across the board with different partners and stakeholders with daily blogs, social media campaigns, coordinated messaging with heat partners, coordination with pharmacies to distribute and inform people taking certain medications about adverse heat effects that could come about. We're also working with the Arizona Department of Transportation to promote heat messaging. They have these boards that are seen in the state of Arizona on the highways, and they do some really neat messaging. We were able to partner with them on a public health aspect during COVID, and are partnering with them with heat messaging going forward to help spread awareness. Also, as mentioned, just translating materials to reach as many community partners as possible. Within our state, we also identified heat response activation tiers, thresholds, and activities similar to what Jane did on her end, so that we can have a little more formalized and standard approach to our heat season going forward. We're also working with state agencies to increase awareness and foster those connections, and also pooling those resources. And that's being established through state level work groups, and also an established interagency resiliency forum that's led by our Governor's Office of Resiliency. That's state leadership and state agencies coming together for decision and planning on that end. We're also going to utilize heat response, those heat response activation tiers and thresholds that lean on the National Weather Service heat advisories, watch, and warnings throughout heat season. We're also going to utilize syndromic heat-related illness data and also EMS call data to help hit certain triggers throughout our state. And it's also adjustable approach and can be modified as needed. We know with any plan or threshold or any item that we have during heat season in Arizona, we need to take a good look at it from year to year and see what modifications we may need to make and make sure that we're implementing best practices as we go forward. And I think also, just to mention, we're also coordinating state level policy and partner work group meetings, and these have been established and are meeting regularly already within our state.
This was helpful. A little note, we spend a lot of our times, coordination means, you got to talk to people and listen and, be involved. And I was with a family member who said to me, "Do you spend all your day on the phone?" I said, is that your job? I said, "No, my job is to make sure you don't die from extreme heat." And he was like, "Oh, okay." So this is what it takes. The coordination is not necessarily easy, and it takes some time to cultivate those relationships. So for those of you out there also looking to build that capacity within your own communities or your own cities, think about some of these working groups, that standing working group or the standing dialogue does seem to help build trust. We found that true also on the federal level, but we hear that repeatedly, that those standing working groups that build that relationship and that trust. We heard that from Jane and now from you. So kudos to you. And it isn't always easy, but it is necessary. I'm going to go on to a couple of data questions because we have a few that are, I'm going to attempt to tie them together a little bit. And one is what data are you using and what's most difficult to acquire? But the other part of that is, are you using early warning systems, which you just spoke to a little bit, Eugene? And are they enough granularity to be able to use for the right populations at the right level? So yeah, data across the board. What are you using? What do you need? And then how are you actually using the forecasts that are available? You've all touched on that a little bit, but if you could drill down on anything else that either is working or not working on that front. And then we're going to go to a cooling center series of questions. So Eugene, you first on this one, please.
Sure. I think as we move forward in Arizona, we are utilizing some strategic data sets that we have available, such as syndromic data that we have available across the state. And we've also leveraged our EMS call data and as mentioned, for our thresholds and tiers as we move through heat season in collaboration with National Weather Service warnings, advisories, and other pieces that will be coming out as we move throughout May to October. So those are our primaries, but we're also looking at ways to streamline and make additional data available so that we can make better decisions. I think we want data for action and be able to drive action across the state as we go forward. So we're hoping to utilize other state agencies and their data sets to be able to come to the table and see what we can do to expand our awareness. So we're currently exploring that and possible MOUs and other avenues to be able to share data as we go forward. I think there was a question about the plans and the thresholds a little bit going on too, and we've had to go through and look at this differently, a little bit differently. We're looking at it from a state perspective, so we know that we can't have a single approach or cookie cutter kind of template applying across the state. So we did come up with different tiers, and within one of our tiers, we do have an initial cautionary period that we'll hit. And we went through that by regional area, and that's identified within our recommendations and findings that accompanied Governor Hobbs' extreme heat preparedness plan. And we basically broke down our state into 4 different tiers: the basin and range, transition, Colorado Plateau, and then we have individual counties of Maricopa and Pima. And each one of those have identified temperature ranges to give low, moderate, and high cautionary period warnings as we move throughout heat season to kind of get ready to go and start prepping, doing different efforts such as planning to extend heat relief center hours, assessing resources inventory and restocking, communication needs and gaps that need to go out to make sure we're reaching the right people, making sure everybody's looking at their plans, their staffing, their backups, and increasing initial high-risk populations that need to get those initial messagings as we go forward. And so we are looking at that data. It's really important to us to have that available, but also look at what we may be able to utilize moving forward for additional tools that we may look at, such as hot mapping across the state to look at cooling centers, locations that may be able to be proposed and other items, or share that with our local partners as they're looking at where they may want to expand in the midst of heat season and other areas too. So I think, we're trying to leverage as much as we can, use what we have available now, but also investigate other areas and other data that may be useful going forward.
Oh, that's a lot to do with that data. I know that you have a good working relationship with your weather forecast office there.
Yes.
And Jane, you I know have been working with them as well, especially on the threshold. So can you also, from your perspective at the more local level, talk a little bit about data, maybe even how that experience went and what you're doing with the forecast, and are they the right scale? What other kinds of things you need?
Yeah, so on the data, we did 2 studies when I first came into this role. One was, I mentioned earlier, looking at heat-related emergency department visits and hospitalizations by zip code, and then aligning it with where are urban heat islands, what are the demographic issues, and that's really helping inform a lot of our interventions. The other study was an excess heat mortality study. This is an area where we clearly need more help with data, because we've done now 2 ways of looking at excess heat mortality. The first one revealed that over the same 5-year period, we had about an average of 34 heat-related deaths a year in Miami-Dade County. The second one, looking more at the chronic heat exposure over days, both peer-reviewed, both approved, same data, 600. Average of 600 deaths a year. So we're trying to address the problem. It's somewhere between 34 and 600 deaths a year.
Yeah.
So and I don't have the advantage. Our state health department, we are talking to them about syndromic data and getting a better dashboard to be able to see at least the 911 calls related to it. We're still working towards that. So that's something, syndromic data is going to be really helpful in our response, if we have another summer like we did last summer, to be able to be more on target. We do know that we had a doubling of emergency calls year over year from the previous 6 years during our highest heat times last summer. So we do know we had increases, but we would like to get a little more granular and get a little more the data earlier, so that we can be more responsive. So both understanding not just directly heat-related issues, but how heat is impacting people's health more broadly is a huge data gap that we need better coding. We need better understanding of how heat is impacting people.
We heard a couple of talks yesterday in, I believe it was the first session, but on the mental health effects and sort of the cascade, that is huge from a number of sources, and the numbers in that were compelling. That's an area I know we don't have a lot of work on, the cascading impacts and mental health and well-being and livelihoods and all of that. So it is hard sometimes to even make the case for why this is important, but now for better or worse, people can't ignore it anymore. But we don't always have great numbers.
Stroke, regular stroke, not heat stroke, regular stroke. All these can be triggered by heat exposure.
Yeah, exactly. So in the interest of some solutions time here, I know I'm going to pick one because we've had a few questions on it, and that is about cooling centers and the nighttime temperatures. We all know that big problem is the nighttime temperatures aren't going down, so the buildings don't cool off, people don't cool off. But cooling centers are still offered as a solution, and often they're only 9 to 5. Sometimes they're schools. How are we going to be opening schools longer? What if school's in session? Are we going to have other cooling centers? What are these resilience hubs? People don't quite understand those. So can you guys speak to that? Recognizing that is only one of the many solutions you are talking about implementing, but we've had a few questions on cooling centers. So if you could address your thoughts and on that would be great. And Jane,
Sure.
you're on the stage here. Go ahead.
Sure. So first, our first strategy is to help people stay cool at home affordably, because we already have pretty high AC penetration here in Miami-Dade County. And a lot of times it's not used because they can't afford it anymore because they're in substandard housing or whatnot, or it breaks down and they can't afford to get it fixed. And so a big focus is that, because we've found that people, even during the day, aren't using the cooling sites to their full potential, or, it's just not where they're choosing to go. Our cooling sites are generally our libraries, some of our park and recreational facilities, and our like transit hubs. So they're places, and we're looking to, we already have extended hours during a heat warning for those sites to 8 p.m., but it is not an overnight facility. People do have to find another place to cool off at night. It's a good point. Right now, we don't have, because we have evacuation shelters if the case of a hurricane and widespread power outages, but that does not get triggered in a heat warning. We haven't heard of the needs. We do, like Eugene mentioned earlier, people experiencing homelessness can be our most at risk during that time at night. And we do have specific facilities for them to be able to lay down a mat and cool off. So that we do have for those instances.
Excellent. Thank you.
And hubs are essentially some of the same facilities, but we want to make sure that they're equipped to handle times of power outages, and they're used for those disaster volunteer and all the preparedness education, as well as during response and recovery, a common place in a neighborhood where people trust and can go for assistance during any type of disaster. That is what a resilience hub is. We're working with various models, whether it's a huge multifamily housing complex that's geared towards the elderly, a faith-based community that's serving a certain community, a library facility. So we're trying different models for those resilience hubs.
Excellent. We're about out of time, so I want to give Eugene a chance to offer any other comments new on the cooling center, and then also any parting words about what you want your state to look like in the future and what you hope other states look like in the future. So cooling centers, and then a final word from you.
Sure. When it comes to cooling centers, I think our state has many local agencies that are working really hard to look at solutions. We have Maricopa County who identified funding to increase cooling center hours and hired a cooling center coordinator on their end. We had the city of Tucson who is looking outside of the box and is moving forward with decarbonized and electric buses and fare-free transit as a mode of being able to give some respite to individuals. We have cities like Phoenix that are opening libraries as cooling centers and having extended hours on that end. And then we have a great network of places of faith that are opening their doors to people in need. One of the things that comes to mind for my position and from a state perspective, though, is that we also need to look at our rural and tribal partners and communities, and they may have certain barriers where some of those solutions aren't as attainable as it would be within our urban areas. They may be dealing with different types of issues or concerns, such as the rural communities can have to travel farther for heat relief or healthcare facilities, or face additional challenges when they're choosing to leave their properties due to animal care and other responsibilities. So I think within our state, we're really looking outside of the box and trying to find some solutions that may work across the board, such as construction of at least 6 retrofitted shipping containers that can be set up quickly as cooling centers and be self-sufficient so that they can be utilized where most needed, and also looking at working with other rural communities to find solutions. So we know that cooling centers do a great job. We have a great infrastructure and effort happening on the grassroots level within Arizona, but we know it may not be as applicable to other more rural and tribal communities across the state. And we need to really kind of look at that and have an equitable approach for all. I think on the question on kind of looking beyond, I think one of the things that we're doing within our state, we're kind of prioritizing 4 primary recommendations. So that's safe, affordable housing and energy, adapting and updating emergency responses, cooling center network improvements and support, and then also data sets, knowledge, and workforce development as priorities moving past 2024. So I'll leave with that, knowing that we're limited on time.
Yeah, those are great marching orders for not only Arizona, but for other states as well. Thank you very much, Eugene. Jane, any parting words about what Miami-Dade is doing and looking the vision for the future? What are you tackling, which you haven't mentioned already?
So I work within the Office of Resilience, where we look at carbon mitigation and adaptation in an integrated way, and there's long-term solutions that address both, which are this, highly efficient buildings, cooling technologies. We're doubling down on that. We're doubling down on green and cool infrastructure investments, with everything from our tree canopy to bioswales to cool pavements and cool roofs. And then land use planning. We want density around our transit and invest in transit. We're getting hotter in our cities, not only because of climate change, but urban heat islands. So that the more that we can cool down with less waste heat from our buildings, less waste heat from our vehicles, and cooler pavements, green infrastructure, all of that's going to contribute to our livable future in Miami.
I think those are great parting words from both of you, all the way from, leaving with a vision of cities and states, but even local communities, whether they're rural, really important. Thank you for raising that, Eugene. We're aware that we often tend to focus on the urban, and that's not necessarily, that's important, but not the only piece. But a world that is actually green and friendly and with innovation in building materials and communication is actually both good for the people and the animals that live in it, but also good for the economy. And it's a win-win all the way around. There's a co-benefit, if you will, to the investments in the long-term heat resilience building. So thank you both so much for your time and a really important panel discussion, and for imparting your wisdom to the group. Thank you all so much for the questions. I'm sorry we did not get to them. We will capture them. And if we didn't get to something approximating your question, we'll try to get an answer for you. So with that, I want to thank both Eugene and Jane for joining us today. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it on to the next session so we don't cut into their time too much. Yeah, thank you all so much. Okay, my job to transition over to Michelle Roberts from HUD, Housing and Urban Development. They, as you heard on day one, are really, really excited to be engaged with us in NIHHIS in the last year or two. And we are excited that they have really reached out and are working with us to help many aspects of HUD sort of engage in the heat space. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you. What a great session. And welcome everybody to our next session, which is keeping indoor spaces safe. I'm Michelle Roberts. I am a social science analyst with the Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Housing within HUD. And I'm based here outstationed in Boston. And I am honored to be able to introduce our kickoff opening speaker, my colleague, Marianne Nazaro. Marianne is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Housing Investments at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. In her role, she oversees over $4 billion, including the Public Housing Capital Fund, Choice Neighborhoods, Family Self-Sufficiency Program, Moving to Work Program, Mixed Finance, Special Application Center, and more. These programs enable PHAs to develop, operate, and sustain public housing and mixed income communities and assist families to become self-sufficient. Marianne is a proud Pennsylvania native, and she received a Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Pittsburgh and a Master's of Social Work from the University of Pennsylvania. I am honored to kick it off with Marianne. Turn it over to Marianne.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle.
You're
And
welcome.
good to see you. And
too.
good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for having us here and for inviting us to speak with you today. As Michelle noted, my name is Marian Azaro. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Public Housing Investments. And so we are serving some of the most vulnerable people across the nation. In our public housing program alone, we are serving over 1.5 million people. And when we're talking about vulnerable, about a third of them are children, and almost half of them are people with disabilities or the elderly. So it's really important that we keep all of our families that we serve healthy. The New York City Housing Authority, who you will be hearing from, I think, later today alone, they are housing more than 150,000 families. And they are doing some really creative things that I'm going to drop a little nugget and then you'll hear more from them. At HUD, our mission is focused not only on housing, but also on the people that we serve and the communities where they live. And we all know that wherever you are, wherever you live, there have to be heat-safe places. We know that there's been significant underinvestment in some communities that we serve, and that is also true for the families that we're serving in public housing. Public housing is honestly, sometimes it's the housing of the last resort for families. And we have to ensure that those families have a safe and healthy and cool place to live. I heard you talking about the rural, don't forget the rural. That's something that my team's hearing from me every day. 75% of the agencies that we serve are in small and rural areas. And so we really, it's important to hear from the New Yorks and the big cities, but we also need to make sure that whatever policies and programs that we have work for the smalls as well, because the heat is increasing across the nation, not just in specific areas. So last year, we did send out notice to all of our housing authorities to let them know how they could use their funds to acquire cooling equipment, pay for the associated costs of cooling, provide cooling centers, those types of things. We encourage agencies to provide cooling spaces in their common areas and make those spaces available to all their residents so that there's a place for them to go to escape the heat. And in New York, NIHHIS, which we call New York City Housing Authority, we call it NIHHIS. They are installing window unit heat pumps, which is a new technology. And so this model has allowed NIHHIS to install highly efficient heating and cooling in buildings with minimal disruption to the families that they serve. So it's a win-win, both as it relates to extreme heat, but also as it relates to providing comfort to the families that live there. Going forward across HUD and kind of working closely with Michelle and her team and across the department, we're looking on a number of options, whether short-term options, longer-term options. A lot of the properties that we have were built not expecting to sustain this type of heat. And so this really creates an opportunity to address the holistic approach to how to address these properties and these neighborhoods. And the examples that we're hearing from NIHHIS and others, public housing is in some ways leading the way on the creativity as to how to tackle this challenge. And as we all know, addressing extreme heat is not only about air conditioning, but we're also looking at nature-based solutions. We're looking at increased energy efficiency and overall resilience. So to that end, soon we will be developing and implementing guidance for our HUD programs on how to take advantage from the various funding streams that are coming down the pike. I'm sure you're aware of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, that might be able to use some energy efficiency and to really reduce the carbon footprint across the HUD portfolio. So again, I'm really glad and energized to see and hear from all of you today. And we really look forward to kind of working together to tackle this challenge. And with that, Michelle, I think I'm going to turn it over to you to moderate this panel that we've got.
Great. Thanks, Marianne. And it's just unbelievable what your office is doing in regards to all the climate issues that we've been having over the past decade and beyond. So I am going to turn it over to Tom Saylor. So if we get him up, we'll introduce Tom. So Tom is going to talk about the heat safe workplace. And I'll just introduce Tom to you. Tom has been the Regional Safety Manager with Aerotech since 2016, serving the Northeastern US, where he provides consultative education and feedback support, contingent to labor engagements, including heat illness awareness and growing OSHA enforcement efforts. He is a committee member for NIHHIS Manufacturing Council, as well as the American Staffing Association Safety Committee. He is also an OSHA General Industry and Maritime Instructor. Wow, what a background. We are so lucky to have you and look forward to seeing your presentation.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Hope
Great.
everybody's hearing me okay today. Greetings wherever you are today. Thanks for joining in. My name is Tom Saylor. I am the Regional Safety Manager with Aerotech. I am based in the suburban Philadelphia area, and I cover territories between Virginia and Maine for our company. I want to say thank you very much, Michelle, HUD, and NIHHIS for the opportunity to present quickly today on heat and the indoor workspace. If we could have our next slide, please. So I'm part of our regional safety team, and we operationally support one of the largest providers of contingent, commonly known as temporary labor, in the United States and Canada. We're consultants for all things associated with joint employer responsibility in meeting US and Canadian workplace safety regulations. We tour often light and heavy industrial indoor working environments to help assess risk and offer solutions to improve operational success for client safety programs, since their program governs the sites where our workers perform duties. Studies have shown that investing minimal financial energy into safety programs yields great returns on your investment. While we're in the business of striving to ensure all workers complete their shifts the same way they started them, we know great behavioral-based safety starts with investment in employer safety programs. Indoor working environments are common encounters for our staffing force, and high heat workplaces are often part of the findings of our regional safety team. If I can have the next slide, please. So there's evidence through lots of studies, and this one particularly is from the state of Washington, that shows that temporary labor often faces higher risks of injuries and illnesses, to include heat illness risks, than their permanent workers that they work alongside. Many industries pictured here have high heat risks in their indoor environments and are showing these higher rates of incident over the length of this study. So what are the contributing factors of the challenge? Well, contract workers or temporary workers, they may be assigned to a more hazardous job over their permanent counterparts. Contractors often are inexperienced, they're unfamiliar with the work operations, the associated hazards, and the protective practices needed for them. They may have language and cultural barriers. They may not feel comfortable speaking up about safety and health concerns or reporting injuries due to a fear of losing their job, or maybe others kind of negative repercussion. Given that contract workers have two employers, they may be confused as to who holds the responsibilities for their safety and health, as well as who holds the responsibilities for maybe managing an injury or an illness if it happens. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, is they might not receive the same site-specific safety and health training, because oftentimes host employers want to get them on board and get them working as quickly as possible. And this is particularly challenging for extreme heat working environments, since studies have shown that workers need time to acclimatize to these kinds of specific kinds of working conditions. If we can have the next slide, please. We're going to talk quickly here this afternoon about specific indoor environments that present high heat challenges. We'll look at some of the tools that CDC, NIHHIS, and OSHA have developed to help employers and employees manage the risk of high heat, and they're great in their families as well too. Then we'll quickly examine worker release strategies, as well as efforts to help specific working environments indoors. Next slide, please. So environments with no climate control are the spaces where high heat conditions are most likely to affect vulnerable worker populations, like temporary workers. Food manufacturing environments often have hot equipment, such as ovens, furnaces, maybe pasteurizing machinery, industrial fryers, and sanitation that has a high pressure steam in it. Workers in skilled trades with heavy uniforms required to protect them from hazards of their equipment or the product and process for which they're executing, they're going to be at higher risk too. Any kind of added PPE, such as vests, hard hats, respirators, if they are required for that workspace. Additional suits. I've oftentimes in previous jobs worn a Tyvek suit. They can be particularly sweaty on the inside, especially if it's a hot environment. And then finally, of course, working in an enclosed space, as well as the upper region of our work environment, like a mezzanine, where heat could rise and be trapped, and also produce elevated risks of heat illnesses for workers. Next slide, please. So coming up on your screen is probably a pictures of some of these environments I just laid out. We can see the hot furnace or foundry-like environment on the left. Temperatures are always going to be hot, and added heat during the summer makes working conditions even more challenging. I mentioned the food manufacturing machinery makes for an added heat challenge, but when you also include what's known as good manufacturing practices equipment, such as hair nets, beard nets, maybe even heavy lab coats and footwear, that's a specialty requirement in order to protect the food that's being made, it becomes more heat trapping for the worker. Steam cleaning operations, they're very warm. And those of us who live up here in the Northeast who are familiar with humid environments, once you add the heat into that humidity together, we know that it can become very difficult to even function in those kinds of working conditions. So there's mezzanines on the lower left there. They're the common in manufacturing, warehouse, and distribution center working spaces. And these can trap heat in addition to confined or enclosed spaces. Hopefully they do have climate control in those kinds of mezzanines. Our welder pictured here wears a lot just to protect them, as I said, from the hazards of the job, but high heat working conditions created by the working environment are going to make job performance more difficult and their health will be more at risk as well. And then finally, old buildings. I want to say a little bit about old buildings. Older brick buildings like the structure you see here, they trap heat. Remember, these kinds of environments were designed well before workplace safety in the United States was written into law in 1970 through the OSHA Act. But they become the kinds of spaces that if you occupy one now as an employer, you have to be doing more in order to meet changing times and increased oversight through inspections. We could have our next slide, please. Let's turn to what you can do. First step is to protect your most valuable asset, and that is your workforce. On the screen, a couple of QR codes if you want to take a screenshot or a download. These are the CDC, NIHHIS, OSHA heat safety tools. OSHA, as Doug Parker was mentioning, is now targeting specific industries and employers, particularly on days when heat will be a priority by virtue of expected temperatures or warnings issued by the National Weather Service. Personally, I expect the NEP that's presently in effect across the United States to need extension as predictions for increasing heat have been well stated throughout this week of presentations. I encourage employers to review their heat illness prevention plans continuously. And let's take a closer look at the tool in the next slide. The beauty of this is it's a simple app for employers and employees, and that's because it can be very location specific. If you plug in your location, you can get not only current conditions, but you can use the clock on the bottom to get a forecast for the rest of the day or the next few days to adequately place work and recovery periods for your workforce. The app provides signs and symptoms of heat-related threats to themselves, coworkers, and family members, and is quickly viewable in Spanish. Right next to that, across the bottom, is the first aid button, which produces the same kinds of information as in case somebody is suspected of a heat illness. This makes a great tool for vulnerable worker populations. The app also can tap into your settings for reminders on things like breaks for hydration and rest as well. So it's a very basic tool, but yet it's encompassing to help employees and employers protect their workforce and reduce risks for citations and penalties for failing to provide proper heat mitigation strategies. Next slide, please. So providing relief to workers in order to help them best perform work in high heat environments is a pillar of ensuring their health and well-being and operational success for your work environment. Strategies need to center around hydration products and cooling products to help them replenish lost fluids while at the same time keeping their core temperatures properly regulated in the challenging conditions. We can't say enough and encourage enough water. Humans are mostly made up of water, and so we need to continuously take it in, especially around extreme heat. Electrolyte supplements can be done through Gatorade, freeze pops, other kinds of sports drinks. And there's products now that also augment electrolytes in them that should be stocked up on in advance of the summer heating season quickly approaching. Personally, I like to encourage water consumption on the front side of the shift, followed by electrolyte consumption on the back end of the shift to help bring the workday to a conclusion and aid in the recovery post-shift for the worker. There's neck gaiters and bandanas, which are popular and affordable products, as well as cooling vests pictured here. Cooling vests, in my opinion, offer some of the best protection for sustained efforts during the workday. You'll get what you pay for, particularly with cooling vests, but they are a product to consider for workers that will spend most of their shift dealing with high heat conditions. Next slide, please. So part of the workplace safety strategy has to involve providing relief to the workforce through a variety of practices and equipment. Shift alteration is a great strategy to allow work to being before the time of day when it becomes too hot and challenging and risky. Generally starting more in the darker hours, obviously, and finishing in the early afternoon is what we're talking about. Knowing the temperature and relative humidity of your workplace should be part of an employer's continuous effort at improvement. When you add in breaks and time to adjust, not only will workers need more frequent breaks throughout the shift, but as mentioned, if they're on a new job, they should be afforded time to acclimatize during the first couple of weeks of their assignment. This is a best practice that if you are not already including it in your plans, we hope you'll consider it. Specialty cooling stations, break rooms, shaded areas and such that allow workers to time to recover and rehydrate are critical. In the case of the picture on the slide here, this is a cooling station that's great because it's individualized to help provide cool air in the space where workers will be performing production on this line here, which is a bakery line. And then finally, air circulation here should preferably be cooler air when it can be generated. There's lots of options to employ equipment on your production floor that can generate cooler airflow. We often see doors open to the indoor environment that lead to the outdoors to help provide airflow into the workspace. Large pedestal fans can help move it around. Hopefully, again, if it's cooler air, that would be best because moving hot ambient air temperature around through the environment may not be as relieving. And so just in closing on the last slide here, I just want to say thanks again for participation of everybody who's on here today. Again, to NIHHIS, to Michelle. It's just an honor to be a part of this today, and my contact information is here. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Michelle. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. That was absolutely fabulous. I have a background in manufacturing and I learned a lot. So we are going to bring it over to Claire Barnett. Claire's going to talk about the Healthy Schools Network. Claire is the executive director of the award-winning nonprofit Healthy Schools Network, which champions environmental health and learning protections for school children. Her work understands that children are not just little adults. Schools are not just little adults. Schools are not just little offices. Many school occupants have chronic health issues. Schools have poor indoor air and sanitation and legacy toxins. In 2020, Claire pivoted the network and its partners to address COVID, climate, children, and schools. She is a member of the National Advisory Committee on Children in Disasters and has been in service to other federal and New York City task forces. We are honored to have Claire join us.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us.
So children are in crisis, as you have probably read from all the news media that's available. Crisis of health, crisis of behavior, crisis in learning, and heat is one more addition to all of that. Slide, please. Children are not just little adults. It's helpful to frame this for everybody, and schools are not just little offices. In fact, there are about 130,000 public and private schools enrolling more than 55 million children and millions of personnel. Roughly 18% of the total US population is in a school every school day. Public schools provide over 8 billion square feet of learning space. They are, in fact, the second largest form of public infrastructure after highways, and they're not climate ready. Slide, please. So we'll drill down just a little bit on children in schools. I have not heard it yet over the last couple of days, but children are uniquely vulnerable to environmental health hazards, and that includes heat. There has been some mention of children in heat in previous sessions. Their skin is more permeable. They cannot recognize hazards, and importantly, they can't remove themselves from harm's way, and they cannot articulate exposures. About 40% of school-age children have one or more chronic illnesses, according to CDC. No state actually tracks children's risks and exposures in the school setting or in childcare. And of course, the newer issue for most of us that we're dealing with now is high heat. And the issue specifically for children is that high heat impedes cognitive performance. And of course, they're in schools for cognitive performance. Slide, please. Schools aren't just little offices either. We want to point out that 95% of school occupants, public school occupants, are women and children. In fact, children outnumber school employees by about 8 or 9 to 1, depending on the age group and what's happening in the building and disability situations and so forth. More densely, schools are actually more densely occupied than offices and typically use more hours per week than offices. There's enough evidence, 2 decades, close to 3 decades of evidence on how the poor conditions of school buildings have adverse impacts on children's health, thinking, learning, and behavior. One of the big differences between children and adults is adults in offices can take breaks. There's a coffee break or a lunch break or a bathroom break. And they can identify occupational hazards and complain about it. Children don't have that capacity or ability. Currently, the Biden administration, fortunately, has sent unprecedented levels of public funding to public schools. But the really difficult issue is the funds are being left on the table. Slide, please. So under climate, many things get worse when you think about buildings that are falling apart. The average age of public schoolhouse now is more than 50 years. That is before EPA ever tried to legislate or regulate things like lead or asbestos or pesticides. Decades of neglect of school buildings mean that they have weak building envelopes, making them more vulnerable to extreme weather events. The lack of knowledge about facilities, it means there's ineffective facility management, which is a clue on why there's money being left on the table. Outdoor hazards for schools are really very difficult because schools tend to buy cheap land. Cheap land is either contaminated or compromised in some way, flooded, for example. Indoor hazards we won't go over because there are too many to count at this point. Slide, please. Just this slide and the next will go really quickly. On the left is a picture of 4,000 parts per million carbon dioxide in a classroom. Adult critical thinking skills start to decline at 1,000 parts per million. There's no fresh air in this classroom, clearly. On the right is a wet building wall, plaster wall that's damp, and it's a good idea to put a fan to dry out a building. But in this case, it's lead paint that's peeling off the wall because of the wetness and the dampness. That means that the fan is actually blowing lead dust over the classroom. Slide. A couple of other things to call attention to. One is PCBs. In the upper right, pesticides having been applied to school garden and school grounds areas. And chemical mismanagement, which is a legacy issue in schools all across the country. On the right, a Cool Whip container, about 40 pounds of elemental mercury wrapped in duct tape, fortunately. Slide, please. So one of the lessons about what the hazards are in schools is that if there is a severe storm and there is storm damage to the building, the legacy toxics, including the products in the building, are going to be released. So that is an issue not only for children in the buildings now, but it's an issue for cleanup workers. After 9/11, my office commissioned a study on the evacuation and the reoccupancy of schools in the impact zone. What we learned from that and documented from that was that no federal, state, or city agency intervened when children were returned to contaminated and unremediated schools in the impact zone. If you remember about 9/11, there was an awful lot of building dust and debris and ash and contaminated air. And all of that infiltrated into buildings and coated the outsides of buildings. By the spring, several months later, we also, as part of the study, we did a backpack survey for parents in elementary and middle school in the area who reported on new onset health issues among school children. So there are still lessons to be learned from this because nobody was tracking what happened to children except that they were required to go back to school. Now, more than 20 years later, NIHHIS is in phase 1 of a 4-phase 9/11 youth cohort study authorized by Congress in 2022. And so there's a big question here, which will lead into in the next slide, please. Here's another episode where California wildfires contaminated the insides of buildings. LAUSD reopened schools, told children to go back to school, but the school buildings were contaminated with wildfire smoke and ash. So pictured on the left is a school protest. Pictured on the right is a baby wipe that picked up soot from a school desk. So the news story that goes with this has to do with teachers talking about the acrid smoke and odors in the classroom. People were supposed to stay inside and not go outside because the outside air was theoretically worse than the inside air, but that was actually the reverse. The inside air was far worse. Slide, please. We think that schools are critical infrastructure for children. And we want to see schools kept open. We want them to be able to recover quickly and safely. About 17 years ago, the National Research Council said that schools should be clean, dry, quiet, free of dust and particulates, have good air and thermal comfort, and well-maintained systems. 17 years later, that's still not true, but now we layer on what kinds of policies are needed for climate. Resiliency, adaptation, enhanced infection prevention and control policies, an environmental public health system that identifies children at risks, the ability to eliminate toxics, beginning to set some regulatory standards. Slide, please. So we'll look at heat. And among other things, I happen to serve on we're based in New York, I serve on a New York State heat advisory group. And over the last year and a half or so, there's been a lot of brainstorming about how to do certain kinds of issues. This has been a fabulous conference for me to be part of. I'm really grateful to everybody for including us. So on the topic of protecting worker health, there's a pretty well established menu, which we've also heard from other presentations here. I think the problem that I'm noticing is there's not necessarily a well-rehearsed agenda on how to protect children. So the question here is protecting worker health. This is an abbreviated menu that I've borrowed liberally from the New York State work. The question is, how can this menu be applied to school children? Can you adjust their hours? Is there an active surveillance program? Can you educate and train the workers? No, you can't educate and train children. Establish heat health reporting standards, inspect and enforce. Who would do that? Slide, please. In another setting, Cool Communities menu, how can this menu be applied to schools or childcares using playgrounds as shaded sanctuaries? And I think everybody has seen lists of these before: micro parks, green infrastructure, tree canopy, water features, and so forth. But the question for schools is, if you repurpose the playgrounds, where do you expect children to play, or how do you want them to change their play? Slide. Institutional resilience menu. Can this menu be applied to schools? We hope it is. Requiring facility heat emergency plans and protocols and standards, ensuring cooling for congregate settings. Schools are very large congregate settings. Require heat safety training for specific personnel, and so forth. So some questions pop up out of this. If schools are public cooling centers, can they still regularly enroll children and conduct education. I think many people who are on this presentation right now understand the schools have some very significant public security issues. If you welcome your community into the school, how do you enclose that? How do you provide security? How do you keep everything else running? Is there reimbursement for cleaning up after the community visit? Another question might be, which K-12 staff need heat safety training? You might say the coaches need it, that's true. But is there even a school nurse? Does the school nurse require training? If the school nurse is trained in finding children suffering from heat exhaustion, is she allowed to report it? Should states set and enforce temperatures in schools? We think they should. Thank you. Slide. Resilient infrastructure. There's another menu. Could this menu be applied to schools and childcare? Resilient land use policies and siting permits, urban heat islands, repurposed fossil fuel infrastructure. 130,000 buildings are largely fossil fueled already. Just a note about that. If you want to repurpose and reuse them, you'd have to build new schools. It takes about 3 to 5 years to put a new building in the ground. Extreme heat ready infrastructure, updated standards. There are a lot of great questions here, but applying them to schools and childcare, should school construction and renovation have an environmental impact statement that has an external review? I'm in New York State. New York State's the third largest K-12 system in the country. School siting is not regulated. There's no requirement to have an EIS that has an external review. Should there be federal funding for school buildings? We think there is. Should schools be required to meet updated standards for their building? We think they should, but they're not required to. They only need to meet the standards for which they were built. Slide, please. So thank you. I'm going to sign off with this to give you a little bit of a tip about school infection prevention and control plans, which we advocated back in July of 2020, and the Harvard COVID Collaborative did as well. The old version is if you're sick, you stay home. And if a sick child is at school, they send them home. But the new version is a little bit different. And CDC has tiptoed now into a really very difficult and wonderful area called infection prevention and control in schools, calling for enhanced ventilation. And ventilation and indoor air always includes thermal comfort, but it needs to be spelled out. Cleaning, disinfecting, and partnering with local public health. Slide, please. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think there are some really great questions here. What I would love to see this effort move forward to is providing a full half day of how do we deal with children and how we deal with schools. It's a very complex topic. It deserves a lot of work, and children themselves deserve a lot of work, because they're 100% of our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Oh, I think you could have a whole conference, a week-long conference about healthy schools. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So we are going to start with Katie Lane. Actually, start with Katie Lane. We are going to listen to her talk about staying safe in the home. And Katie, we are honored to have you. And just to let everybody on this call know that April is the official National Healthy Homes Month within HUD. So we are honored to have Katie. Katie is the Senior Environmental Epidemiologist in the Bureau of Environmental Surveillance and Policy at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, where she conducts policy relevant analysis of public health impacts on extreme weather and climate change. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be part of this panel. So next slide. I'm going to be talking about some efforts in New York City to extend access to home cooling, but I first just very quickly want to remind people why home cooling is so important. So we know, I think other speakers today have talked about how heat health impacts occur along a range of temperatures, and extreme heat days are the most dangerous, but health impacts also happen on hot but not extreme days. So that's it can happen season long. The indoor temperature in homes without air conditioning can be hotter than the outdoor temperature. And we know in New York City from surveys that many New Yorkers who don't have home cooling stay home in hot weather, regardless of whether they've seen a warning. And at the same time, the most common setting in New York City for heat stroke deaths is unair-conditioned homes. And homes are also where we see more deaths from heat exacerbated chronic conditions. So sometimes these are also called excess deaths. And we have on average about 350 of those deaths every year. So these are all preventable deaths. The figure on the right shows an update of a study that we did a while ago with academic partners to look at individual and neighborhood level risk factors for heat exacerbated deaths from chronic conditions. And we see, those deaths do occur more at home during multiple definitions of hot weather. And at the neighborhood level, there are fewer deaths in neighborhoods with more home air conditioning and with higher median incomes. So as you would expect, these are protective. Neighborhoods that are hotter and are home to more people of color are more impacted. And so we see these inequities by race, both at the individual level and the neighborhood level. And these risks aren't biologic. They're a reflection of structural racism in economic, healthcare, housing, and multiple other systems. Next slide. So the city has been working on increasing access to cooling at home using several strategies, and I'm going to talk about a few of them here. One happened in late spring and early summer in 2020 when New York City was coming out of the first really terrible COVID-19 wave that we experienced, and many places that would have served as cooling centers were still closed. So the city implemented an emergency program to install and distribute about 73,000 home air conditioning units in homes so that people could stay home safely during social distancing. The program was targeted to low income and older adults. And there was also a small summer utility bill credit for about 440,000 low income electricity customers. So we at the health department did an evaluation of that program with partners that included the New York City Housing Authority, which installed many of these units, Columbia University, and We Act for Environmental Justice. And the map on the left shows the distribution of many of these units, which did go to in general to our most heat vulnerable neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So to evaluate the study, we did a survey of people who got an air conditioner, and we also surveyed a comparison group of non-eligible New Yorkers without air conditioning. And again, respondents in both groups were primarily lower income New Yorkers of color. And we found that folks who got the air conditioner were more likely to stay home in 2020 and could stay cool there compared to people without AC, adjusting for both age and race and ethnicity. They were also more likely to stay home compared to themselves in 2019. And they were much less likely to say that they felt sick at home from the heat compared to people, the group without air conditioning. And they also said they could feel more comfortable there. Next slide, please. So again, who is most exposed to these hot temperatures at home? Most New York City households have at least one air conditioning unit, 91% of households, but there are large inequities by neighborhood. You can see that in the graph of air conditioning coverage on the right. Some neighborhoods have only about 75% coverage. We also know from previous surveys that Black New Yorkers and lower income households are much less likely to have air conditioning or be able to afford to run the air conditioner. So extending access to cooling and affordable energy, they're both issues of safety and equity. Next slide. Our evaluation survey also showed that there were a lot of obstacles across both groups, the folks who got an air conditioner and those that didn't, to getting cooling in the past. And those were really centered on costs of the air conditioning unit, the cost of the electricity to run the unit. And this is really important. It's a part of a larger problem called energy insecurity, or the not being able to meet your household energy needs. And for some folks, turning on the air conditioner is really prohibitive. It's a prohibitive expense. But for others, it's an expense that you don't even think about. People were also concerned about the cost of installing the air conditioner, as well as fees that landlords or other agencies can sometimes charge for having an air conditioning unit, even if it's very small. It can be a barrier for people who are financially stretched. Next slide, please. So another way that we can get cooling equipment to people who need it is the Home Energy Assistance Program, which has a cooling assistance component. And this is a really just absolutely critical federally funded program that I think we're going to hear a little bit more about. And in New York State, it provides an air conditioner with installation for people who qualify, as long as funding lasts. But in New York State, the program doesn't help with energy bills in the summer. So in the city, we found that making it possible for people to apply online has been really helpful to encourage more applications, as has been loosening some criteria around medical documentations for people, for households with older adults and young kids. But the needs really exceed the current funding levels. And so it's really just an important program that needs more funding across the board. And another way to extend access to home cooling is through policy, both because of the large burden of heat mortality that we experience, the inequities of who it impacts, and increasing risks from climate change. In 2023, our Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice stated the city's intention to develop a maximum summer indoor temperature policy by 2030 and to require cooling for new construction by 2025. Next slide. But addressing heat and climate change is going to require a holistic strategy, right? It's going to be a yes and type of situation. And home cooling is going to have to be just one piece of that whole package. But it also means if we're really going to be extending this access, people are also going to need to be able to run their air conditioners. So we do need subsidies to help with summer utility costs. And just in general, low and middle income customers are going to be able to need to be able to afford energy so that they can keep their homes at safe temperatures. Protections against electricity disconnections for non-payment can help people stay safe. We have some protections in New York City. Of course, energy efficiency, weatherization are really important to decrease costs and protect the grid. Another way to protect the grid is to discourage too much cooling in offices, which are also more empty, and in commercial establishments that may not need it for health. Next slide. And so, we feel that we really can't afford to wait because our city is getting hotter. And as you can see from our climate projections on the left, that it's just going to continue to get hotter. And our housing was built for a different and much cooler climate to trap heat. But along with that urgency that we feel, there's a lot of opportunity. Electrification can allow for decarbonization, efficient cooling, and addressing health equity all at the same time. And so a really promising example of this is an innovative program at NIHHIS, which our wonderful introductory speaker mentioned, where they basically incentivized the production of cold climate window heat pumps for large apartment buildings. And they're, in the process of installing and testing these now. So I just, want to leave with that great example as a way of that we can address some of these problems, keep people safe, and mitigate climate change. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Katie. That was fabulous. And again, these will, the video of all the presentations will be posted. So we are going to turn it over to Heather Jones. Heather is the Policy, Data, and Evaluation Branch Chief of the Office of Community Services Division of Energy Assistance. Low-income, this is a long one, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. Prior to this role, Heather was the Senior Advisor for the Low-Income Household Water Assistance Program. Before joining OCS, Heather served as the Missouri LIHEAP Program Manager for 15 years. Heather has experience in project management, policy development, training, and grant management. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Business Administration and a Master's of Public Administration from the University of Missouri. We are honored to have Katie Lane join us.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to thank NIHHIS for the opportunity to present about the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or what we refer to as LIHEAP. I've heard many speakers referencing LIHEAP and just want to extend my thanks for having the federal office present here today. Next slide, please. The purpose of LIHEAP is to keep individuals and families safe and healthy through providing assistance with energy costs. LIHEAP is a block grant that allocates federal funds to over 200 grant recipients, including states, tribes, and territories, to assist home energy bills, crisis, weatherization, and minor energy-related home repairs. LIHEAP's target populations are households with the lowest income that particularly pay the highest amount of home energy, so they have that highest home energy burden. It also targets households that include members with older adults and young children and disabled individuals. We know the impact, and we've heard a lot of speakers speak about this during this time period that we've been together, the impact of extreme temperatures have on these type of populations. LIHEAP manages by providing assistance with, like I indicated, home heating bills and cooling assistance, and providing crisis and weatherization, and also includes education and counseling. Next slide. So here I've displayed several LIHEAP resources that are available through our websites, and you will be provided some links to this after the presentation. But our Office of Community Services Disaster Response provides a one-stop shop where all the information you need to help your organization or even your customers start to prepare to respond to a disaster using the OCS funding. It includes live weather activities, disaster flexibilities, and it also includes the grant recipient tools for their flexibilities with their funding. So the next resource is LIHEAP and Extreme Dashboard, which is also located on the NIHHIS website. It provides information on the progression of extreme heat over time, the health impacts of extreme heat, and a visualization of how LIHEAP will alleviate extreme heat stress for vulnerable populations, including the impact that LIHEAP has on reducing energy bills and assisting LIHEAP households staying cool during a heating event. Flexibilities that grant recipients can adjust, and this is all dependent, as we heard from New York, on what that grant recipient decides to do, is they can address extreme heat that includes services like repair or replacement or cooling equipment with air conditioning units. They can also provide heat pumps, evaporation coolers in low humidity areas, and provide transportation to cooling centers, create programs to check in on older adults or individuals with disabilities or young children. The next resource I'd like to highlight is LIHEAP Data Dashboard that includes national and grant recipient information for the current federal fiscal year, including funding allocations, categorical eligibility, and income eligibility, the target groups, and our minimum and maximum benefits. LIHEAP grant recipients are required to submit quarterly reports during the current federal fiscal year that include information about the administration of LIHEAP. This includes funding obligations, assisted households, and the number of times that LIHEAP has restored or prevented loss of home energy. It also includes a visual display and reports how these use of funds are being obligated in comparison with the allocation of each grant recipient receives. If I could stress just one resource, and I know we're coming up on a break, it would be the resource on the right. This is our National Energy Assistance Referral Hotline. It's called NEAR, which you can find very easily and can put in any of your material by just putting the URL energyhelp.us. This site provides a phone number, an email address, or a search function for a low-income customer to locate their local LIHEAP agency to apply for assistance. I appreciate NIHHIS putting this front and center on their website so that we can direct low-income customers to get the assistance that they need as they face these situations. Next slide, please. We also develop toolkits for our grant recipients as well as our public to continually do outreach around heating and cooling assistance, but in particular, we're working right now on updating our information for cooling assistance. This one you'll see a lot of our heating tools, but we're moving towards updating that information and hope to have some release next week with the celebration of Earth Day. So this includes flyers, videos, social media outlet, and we've even included several different languages, including Chinese, simplified Chinese, and then English and Spanish and some Native American languages. So we're really trying to reach out to all of our communities to make them aware of the assistance that they can receive and that they should apply for our assistance. Next slide, please. So I'm also including at the end of this is the LIHEAP websites that I've covered in this presentation, but I always like a slide that has all the websites on one page because I reference them quite a bit. But I also wanted to include some things that I may not have covered in this presentation, including our contact information. That contact information includes all the information about the Division of Energy Assistance, including me, my staff, and other members that work in our team, and how you can reach out to them if you need additional assistance. We have maps that indicate our grant recipients, their name, their contact information, and websites. And so I always point out that contact information because if you have any questions or need any additional information about LIHEAP, please don't hesitate to reach out to Health and Human Services. I know we have a long title, and you can go to the next slide, but in the Division of Energy Assistance, we're all here to work to increase outreach, understanding, and to provide our low-income citizens with the desperate help they need with heating and cooling assistance, and cooling assistance becoming more of a concern as we see more of the country heating up. So again, want to thank NIHHIS for highlighting us and the other speakers for referencing the low-income home energy assistance program. And I'll just leave you with one story because I know I'm the person between you and a break. When I worked in the state of Missouri, I had a woman call me from the St. Louis, and it was going to be an extremely warm day. And during that warm day, our heat indexes were headed to 115 that day. And she was worried because it was 9:30 in the morning and her cat was panting. And any of us that have cats and love cats know cats don't pant unless they're under extreme distress. And so what it was telling me is the stable person in her downtown St. Louis apartment was in a really serious situation. The cat was kind of the canary in the coal mine. So we contacted the utility company, and she had been approved for LIHEAP for crisis assistance to get her electricity turned back on. But because her social security number got transposed, the reconnection didn't happen. Once we fixed that morning, a truck was sent out to reconnect her utilities. And she was so grateful, and she called and she was telling me, "Oh, my cat's better." And I'm like, "Well, how are you? Are you comfortable? Are you okay?" And I've never forgotten that as a LIHEAP director. And I always tell this story. Yes, the cat was okay, but more importantly, our low-income customer was okay. But sometimes we have to cut through everything and make that happen, and how critical that this money can be. So I remember that customer as I do my work in day out. And we have many references on our websites to those particular stories. And I encourage people to go out and to listen to those stories. I start my day that way to keep me grounded in the work we do and the difference we make. Yeah. One last thing I'll say, when the power is on, we don't give it a second thought, but when it's off, we can't think of anything else. And that becomes particularly true during a heat event and an extreme heat event. And so we need to all work together to do our best to take care of each other and to get through those extreme heat events. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Heather. Your office is just priceless, and what you're able to offer. It's wonderful. So we are going to take a break from now until 2:20, and we look forward to seeing you in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Right. Hi, everybody. I know there was a short break, but we are almost back on track time-wise, and we just have a couple more sessions to close out NIHHIS National Meeting. So this next one is hosted by the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and it focuses on resilient housing solutions. Our moderator, Juanita Constable, is a senior advisor at NRDC, where she helps advance solutions to the health and safety threats of extreme heat. She's particularly focused on protecting workers and integrating equitable heat preparedness into federal and state policies and programs. Prior to joining NRDC, Juanita oversaw the Science and Solutions Department at the Climate Reality Project, and later served as an advisor to the Climate Action Campaign. She holds bachelor's and master's degrees in biology from the University of Victoria, and those are from back when Western Canada didn't have to worry about things like killer heat domes. So I will turn it over to Juanita to start this session.
Thank you so much, Paul. And can folks see my video? I am not seeing it on my screen.
Yes, we have you. Thanks.
Thank you. Happy Thursday, everyone. Before we get started, I do have a little confession I want to make. Part of the reason I suggested the topic for this panel today is because I am not a housing expert myself, although I do feel a little smarter after hearing that last session. As Paul said, most of my work at NRDC is on occupational heat. And as I've been learning over the last few years, many of the low-wage Black and Brown people most affected by heat at work are also strongly affected at home. The topic of heat at home is also deeply personal for me. Several of my family members are low-income renters, and a handful of them have the kind of mobility and transportation challenges that would make it impossible for them to get to a cooling center on their own, even if there was one nearby. And so I'm really looking forward today to hearing from our three distinguished guests. I hope you will all get as much out of this session as I plan to. With that, let's get started. First up is David Kaniski. David is the Linton K. Caldwell Professor of Environmental Studies at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Bloomington. He also is the co-director of the Energy Justice Lab, which has a mission to explore, measure, and improve the equity and justice dimensions of society's ongoing energy transition. David's research has been published widely in leading scientific journals, and he has authored or edited 6 books. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Department of Energy, and the Russell Sage Foundation. Welcome, David, and over to you.
Thank you, Juanita, and thanks to all the organizers and for everyone for participating in this really important few days. It's really a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. As Juanita mentioned, I am a co-director of the Energy Justice Lab, and one of the projects that we've been working on now for a number of years is trying to understand the challenge that people have affording energy in their homes, and what happens when they lose access to that energy. So my focus today is to talk about that problem a little bit, as well as to focus in on some of the utility disconnection protection policies that are in place and could use to be improved to help address some of these issues. Next slide, please. So just to get us started, as a basic statistic, every year in the United States, about 1 in 4 households experience what we call energy insecurity, which includes everything from challenges paying for your monthly energy bill, could be electricity or natural gas or heating oil, to facing the trade-offs between having to pay an energy bill and not be able to afford food or healthcare or other basic necessity. So this is a pretty ubiquitous problem for many people across the country. Next slide. So obviously, as the subject of a lot of our discussion these last few days is thinking about what happens in the home when we lose access to energy and thinking about what that means for losing access to cooling, right? And obviously, if you lose your access to electricity or even natural gas, you might have a challenge keeping your home comfortable during extreme weather events, including hot temperatures. But obviously, we use energy for lots of other things as well, right? Simple things like keeping our devices charged, to connecting our kids for their schooling. Those who are reliant on electronic medical devices obviously need to power those devices. So we take this for granted, but for a lot of Americans, it's a persistent problem of potentially losing their service when their utility shuts them off due to a non-payment of their bill. Next slide. So how big of a problem is this? Well, the best we can tell, about 2 million households in the United States had their electricity or natural gas shut off due to non-payment last year. I should note that this is a vast undercount of the true number of shutoffs because we don't have full disclosure, full reporting across the country. This comes from data that we've collected as part of our utility disconnections dashboard. It only really accounts for maybe half of the households across the country because many of them live in states where reporting is not required, so we don't know the full picture. But again, 2 million households is a lot of people who are losing access to electricity because of a challenge paying for their bill. Next slide. So who is disconnected most often? Well, I mean, it probably goes without saying that people who are suffering material hardship, people living in extreme poverty are much more likely to experience energy insecurity and as well as the threat or the actual disconnection of their service. But we also know even controlling for income, households of color, families with young children, people, again, who require electronic medical devices, and those living in poor housing conditions, whether they're energy inefficient homes or in homes or rental apartments where there's inoperable or inefficient heating and cooling systems. So disconnections affects the most vulnerable parts of our country. Next slide. So I think it has been discussed quite a bit. When people lose access to affordable, reliable energy in their home, there are lots of consequences that we know about. There's been considerable research done over some time now that shows that when there is energy insecurity in one's home, it is correlated with long-term poverty. It's associated with all sorts of acute and chronic health conditions. These are both physical health conditions, but also mental health conditions. There are really negative effects for children, not just health, but also performance in school. So this is something that we care about for lots of reasons. Next slide. Okay, so turning our attention now then to policies. You could advance the animation a couple of clicks. This whole chain of sort of this struggle, people having challenges paying their energy bill, facing the possibility of disconnection, and then actually being disconnected. We can think about different interventions at different stages of that sequence. On the top there are a whole number of payment programs and other sort of policies or initiatives that might help people better afford energy through arrangements with their utilities. There are also technological things that can be done to help people afford energy in their homes to hopefully avoid the disconnection scenario that I have been discussing. From a federal policy standpoint, and oftentimes local and state policy, there are things we can do in people's homes to make them more energy efficient. Think about weatherization, for example, and other kinds of technological improvements that might help people afford energy in their homes. We just heard a presentation about LIHEAP in the past panel, right? When people do face a challenge paying a bill, they may be able to seek energy assistance if they're eligible for those programs. And then there are things that might be done to avoid disconnections when people sort of reach that stage. Now I'm going to focus the rest of my time thinking about these disconnection protection policies that exist in some states and think about how they particularly apply in the context of heat. Next slide. So one of the things that we've done at the Energy Justice Lab is build this utility disconnections dashboard, which you can find at utilitydisconnections.org. It'll direct you to the dashboard itself. One piece of this dashboard is to collect, compile, organize, display information about utility disconnections across the country. But the other piece of it, which I want to focus on today, is the policy map that we have created. We've gone through every state across the country and documented the availability of different protections that customers have when they are unable to pay their bill from disconnections from the utility. And I'll talk about those here in the next few slides. Next. So the most common type of protection that customers have due to non-payment are what are sometimes referred to as seasonal moratoria or extreme weather moratoria. And these are in place to protect customers from having their energy services shut off due to non-payment during extreme weather. It's very common across the country to see these in place for cold weather, right? Either when there are extreme cold temperatures, or sometimes they are date-based protections that cover winter months, often December, January, February. And about 4 of 5 states across the country have these kind of cold weather protections in place. What you'll note here on the slide is that only 20 states have similar heat-based protections. Protections that are either date-based, there are a couple of states like that, which may set aside a few summer months where shutoffs are disallowed due to non-payment during extreme or for particular periods of time, or they're temperature-based, right? If temperatures reach a certain threshold, or if there's a heat advisory, utilities may be constrained or restricted in some way from cutting people off from their energy service. But you'll note here is that we have yet to catch up to the reality that disconnections are just as damaging or just as threatening to people's sort of health during heat events, right? We've been much more historically focused on cold. Next slide, please. So this is a map that shows you sort of the distribution of these policies, these heat-based protections across the country. You can see they're most common in the western part of the country, as well as in sort of the central part of the country. But good sort of large swaths of the country don't have heat protections in place at all. Can you advance the animation? Just give you an example of how these look. Here are a couple of examples from Georgia and Colorado. You'll see in Georgia, it's a policy that essentially says if there's an expectation from the National Weather Service of a heat advisory or excessive heat warning, then disconnections are not allowed on the following day. And similarly in Colorado, it's more of a temperature-based policy. So these are just kind of some examples of what these policies look like. What I think the map really illustrates is that there are big parts of the country that don't have these protections in place, at least at the state level. So there's a lot of room for enhancing and strengthening these kinds of disconnection policies across the country. Next. Just one last slide on our dashboard, just give you a sense of what's available to you as a resource. The dashboard, again, tracks policies across the country, referring to these disconnection protection policies. I've been talking about these heat-based protections. There's also information state by state on protections for different subgroups of the population. Often these are medical exemptions or for other vulnerable populations. We have information about notification procedures that are required. Things utilities have to do in advance of disconnecting people. For every state, we have a detailed narrative of what the policy looks like in that state, which provides more nuance and granularity to what state policy looks like. All the data we have compiled is available for download. So if you want to see how policies vary across the country, you're able to access that information in total. And there's much more information available for those interested in learning more about disconnection protection policies across the country. I'll just conclude by saying I'm part of a large team at the Energy Justice Lab, and was certainly not without their massive contributions have we been able to complete this work. So there's a big team working on these issues, and I want to acknowledge their contributions. Thank you.
Amazing, David. Thank you so much for that. Now let's zoom from the national and state scale into the local level by welcoming Kim McCarty. Kim has been the executive director of the Community Alliance of Tenants, otherwise known as CAT, since 2020. She believes strongly in CAT's mission to educate and empower tenants to demand safe, stable, and affordable rental homes. Her work at CAT, which is led by the tenants it serves, includes environmental justice initiatives around wildfire and heat impacts, demands for rent and eviction moratoriums due to the COVID public health emergency, rent stabilization, eviction protections, and meeting the need for emergency rental assistance. Before working at CAT, Kim had a 14-year career in housing at the City of Portland. Thanks for joining us, Kim. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Juanita. Hi, I'm Kim McCarty, Executive Director of Community Alliance of Tenants, and I'm going to be talking to you about some of the changes that happened in Oregon to offer more protections to people generally when it came to heat. And it was especially impactful for the people that we serve, which are tenants. I want to start off first by saying that this work couldn't have been possible but without a broad coalition. And it was, as other speakers have pointed out, heat issues have been especially impactful to communities of color because of economic and racial segregation that often puts us in places where there's heat islands, as an example. And so it was community-based organizations, organizations that were led by communities of color that were really instrumental in the passage of this particular legislation, namely Verde here in the metro area, Living Cully, and the Energy Trust of Oregon. Next slide, please. So CAT was formed in 1996. We've been around for over 25 years. We primarily serve low-income tenants, and our mission is to educate and empower tenants to demand safe and stable, affordable homes. We couldn't do that without the tenants because we're a small organization, and unfortunately in Oregon and elsewhere in the country, tenants have very few organizations that support their interests. Next slide. So why were we concerned about this issue, an environmental justice issue, an environmental issue? One is, I think it's important to understand Oregon, we're a temperate zone. Very few buildings have central heat or cooling. The cost for low-income tenants for an AC unit is prohibitive. Utility costs is a big consideration. Even if you have heating or cooling devices, you may not turn them on because of utility costs. There are prohibitions in our state historically where the landlords won't allow you to install these devices, and there's a real risk of eviction if you were to do so because it would be a violation of your lease. There's also the danger that you would be evicted if you didn't pay your utilities, because sometimes the utilities are centralized, the landlord's paying it. And so if you don't pay your portion of the bill, you could be evicted with, as much as just little as 30 days notice. Then there's also just knowledge of how to mitigate impacts. As I said, we're a temperate zone. So it's a surprise for many people when they are experiencing extreme heat or extreme cold, and may not know what to do about it. And it's especially true that there's a fear of eviction, because if you're a low-income tenant, you're less likely to have a place that you could go that's equivalent. If you're a Black, Indigenous, person of color, immigrant, or refugee, you're also more likely to experience harassment and also are facing fewer opportunities to find other places of housing. Next slide, please. And so why it was important to CAT as a tenant issue, it's been important to us. Like I said, we've been around for over 25 years. It was mostly an issue of dignity. Why is it as a tenant that I can't have control over my environment? It is also, of course, a health issue. And until the heat dome of 2021 came, it was an issue that as an organization advocating for tenants, we couldn't get traction on this issue because it wasn't the most important thing on the table. But when people were dying, then we were able to elevate this as an issue, and we're able to connect it to public health and get some resolution. Next slide, please. So as I said, utilities are often included in rent, heating and cooling. These are many of the issues of why tenants care about this issue. And I'll go on to the next slide. And the reason that tenants want this resolved, because it's an issue of dignity, control, air quality, the cost of utilities. As I said, it was really urgent because hundreds of people died in the Northwest, and it was quite avoidable, both as a communications issue and then also if we were to take some of the measures that I'll explain later. Next slide. So what happened in Oregon? In June of 2021, the Northwest experienced what was called the heat dome. In a typical year in Oregon, no one dies from heat exposure. But on this week in June, temperatures got up to 116 degrees. Over 96 people died from heat exposure in Oregon. Over 250 people were visiting the hospitals. And we know that all told over the Northwest region, including Canada, Oregon, and Washington, 800 people died. It was estimated that month that was 3 times the normal rate of suggesting a hidden toll on death that maybe isn't captured in that number. There was a wildfire increasing at that time. So air quality issues were also a part of the picture. And most of the deaths, from what I observed from research, took place in urban heat islands. So that's why it was very concentrated in Multnomah County, where we have our largest city of Portland. And heat islands tend to be areas of lower income, less tree canopy, and more asphalt. Next slide. And who was most impacted? Interestingly, 2/3 of the death were white men. 71% of the people who died were living alone. Most did not have AC. The most vulnerable appeared to be elderly and people with health concerns. Other characteristics included homelessness, living in a mobile home, multifamily, living in an upper story unit, not having access to AC or shade, and then again, heat islands, where lower income communities are tending to live, fewer trees, more asphalt, more heat conditions. One thing to know about Oregon is that on the whole, Oregon has fewer people of color. And so that might lend to some of these numbers that we're observing. I haven't seen the analysis. Also, this was at the time of COVID. So there's some questions about what access people had to information, to people checking in on them, issues of isolation. Next slide, please. So from this, there was generally a sense that urgent action was needed. So what we were looking for were laws to protect tenants, resources so that tenants could purchase heating and cooling devices, better education about impacts, creation of cooling centers, resources for utility assistance. Next slide. And a couple of policies came into place. One was the Wildfire Hazard Mitigation Act. So it was very resource intensive. We knew that we wouldn't be able to respond with a lot of money to buy these things to help with utilities. So that next slide. And then also the Emergency Relief Senate Bill 1536, which created public warming and cooling centers, and some guidelines for when buildings should be alerting people to hazards, and also giving tenants access to air conditioners and utility assistance. And next slide. And then there were some changes to this that happened this last year, which would require landlords to make reasonable accommodations to allow tenants access to cooling devices, and just clarified what the tenant and landlord rights were. Next slide. And then further, there's more information here. You can look at the slides later that landlords did have options to require installation. And this was a problem, there's a lot of conversation. It seemed to be a loophole where tenants weren't really getting their needs met. And so that's something that we're still debating. Next slide. And as was discussed, in Oregon, there wasn't a lot of law about when you needed to think about heat. And so that did change that year, where landlords could not force a tenant to move or to move their AC during a time of extreme heat. And next slide. And so in 2024, there were some additional changes, namely that landlords must allow portable freestanding air conditioners and winded-mounted air conditioners. And there was also a lot of conversation, of course, like if we're going to put all this investment in air conditioners, which can be also damaging to the environment, let's try to emphasize heat pumps. Next slide, please. And with the right to cooling implementation, some examples included in Portland, over 3,000 heat and cooling devices were installed for low-income households. Prioritization for people who are older or living alone. A lot of the money was going through community nonprofits, and we knew that many people of color, immigrants, and refugees would not have access to this money and these resources. So we also emphasized making sure that these funds went through culturally specific organizations. Next slide. And that was the big role of Kat, Verde, and other advocates, making sure that low-income tenants, Black, Indigenous, people of color were connected to these resources through community organizations. And next slide. And there are still many issues of debate, who can afford air conditioners versus heat pumps? What will be the climate impacts of bringing so many air conditioners into a community that historically had just relied on airflow, opening the windows? There are still many debates with the landlords about how to install these air conditioners and whether or not people's rights are being respected. The next slide. And of course, what is the right way to address this issue? Is it communication? Is it cooling? Is it cooling centers? It's probably a little bit of all of the above, and all of those issues were debated. And next slide. Thank you so much for this time. I really appreciate being a part of this conference.
Thank you so much for your critical work, Kim. It's been a real pleasure having you here today. Finally, let's turn to the important question of how to pay for the heat resilience improvements that communities so desperately need. Our last speaker is Stephen Morrell, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Montgomery County Green Bank. In this role, he oversees the Green Bank's programs and financial products that are dedicated to drawing in commercial capital and accelerating the climate goals of Montgomery County, Maryland. Prior to the Green Bank, Stephen's roles in investment banking research, commercial banking, and international project finance honed a deep interest and skill set in impact investing and blended finance. Originally from Denver, Colorado, Stephen came to the DC area for an undergraduate degree from the George Washington University and graduate degree from Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Steve, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Very much appreciate being at this really important conference and this important discussion today. My name is Steve Morrell. I'm the CEO of Montgomery County Green Bank, as Juanita said. That is Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside the DC area. Although there are many Montgomery counties across the US, and maybe we can help represent many of them in the future. For those of you not familiar with the Green Bank, we're part of a movement that actually started at a national level, several national green banks popping up in the United Kingdom, Australia, other countries. And when the movement came to the United States, they started popping up at the state level, Connecticut, New York, and other states. Montgomery County was the first county level green bank created and funded by the county in order to help combat the climate crisis that we're experiencing in the county, in Maryland, and across the world. We are a public-private partnership. We are not a traditional bank, despite what the moniker says. We don't have an ATM in the lobby that people can come and take deposits. But Green Bank is an important moniker because we work with the private sector to leverage all of our benefits out into the community from both an equitable transition perspective and maximizing the type of climate benefits that we can bring to the county. So we believe that an incredibly important strategy to mitigating the hazards of heat is to catalyze impact with private finance. In 2023, Green Banks caused $7 billion of investments in clean energy and climate resilience projects. 4.5 came from the private sector. That's up over double from the previous year. So we feel like the movement has been successful in demonstrating the great benefits of leveraging finance. Montgomery County Green Bank specifically has a vision that we create a prospering, sustainable, healthy Montgomery County where everybody participates in and benefits from clean energy and climate resilient solutions. Like most green banks, we are established independent from the county. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, although we have a couple of seats from the county that sit on our board. Again, exclusively dedicated to achieving the climate action plan objectives that were set out by Montgomery County, Maryland. And so this structural mechanism has allowed us to work with the private sector relatively from a nimble perspective and work to crowd in more private sector investment. We think that this sector is incredibly important, given some of the hazards that you've heard, to work throughout all of Montgomery County, which is actually a very diverse county with varying income levels as well, and significant hazards exist in really places that not everybody would expect. And so heat being such a key one, we've worked with a lot of property owners and developers to be able to figure out how do you finance these mechanisms. And fortunately, we've been able to work on some resiliency hub projects in the county where we've been able to finance solar and storage solutions. The storage capacity is large enough to be able to power community centers in the event of power outages. There was a headline recently that I know folks in the Mid-Atlantic probably saw, but maybe nationally you saw as well. I think it was November 2022, there was a plane that actually accidentally flew into one of our transmission lines. Fortunately, everybody was safe, but the way that everybody was safe is that they had to turn off the power for the entire neighborhood grid. The only place that was operating was a pet shelter, which was a resiliency hub. And it's incredibly important that people had access to this place for cooling purposes, as well as storing medicines that needed to be refrigerated. And we thought that was a great example. In terms of finance, there is a financial imperative and a benefit for the private sector to participate, just as any clean energy project that's out there. And so as the Green Bank, we really enjoy investing in resiliency hubs throughout the community. We will be launching the first complete private sector affordable multifamily resilience hub in Montgomery County. And I think it may be the first in Maryland overall next month. It was an entire property electrification. We were able to drive down the cost of electricity to the folks that live in the building and then create a community benefit with this resilience hub. So we think this is a great mechanism. We're happy to see many more green banks popping up across the United States, given a lot of the greenhouse gas reduction fund money that's flowing down. This was all stemming from the Inflation Reduction Act that passed recently that helped with tax credits, as well as granting of money to be able to help on clean energy and climate resilience projects. So thank you again for having me, and happy to answer any questions and provide any more color as I can.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Please give our speakers a warm virtual round of applause. I just so appreciate your time today. We do have some time for questions, so if people in the audience would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A function, and I'll invite our speakers to come back on camera so we can talk about a few more things. Kim, if you're ready, I'd like to start with you. You talked a little bit in your last slides about implementation challenges, and I'm wondering how you and your partners are planning to address some of those in the next year or two, especially as heat season is quickly coming.
Thank you. I'm not really intimately at this point involved in implementation, but I can tell you kind of what I'm observing from afar. When we put this legislation in place, and it was to respond to an emergency. So the response was very emergency oriented. Let's get the money. Let's put up the basic framework, but it actually took several years, as you can see, to implement it, to find the partners, to get the resources out, get the materials out. And then also what we're seeing on a local level is landlords are not always complying. We still get, our organization is basically a hotline. People call us and say, I have a problem with my landlord, what do I do? And one of those problems that we get every winter, every summer is I'm afraid of being evicted because I'm putting in an AC unit. And we tell them you have the right to put in an AC unit, but even though we tell them that they have that right, it doesn't mean that the landlord is respecting it.
I see that problem all the time. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Stephen, I'll turn to you next. What advice would you have for states or localities that want to start their own green bank?
Yeah, thank you, Juanita. That's a good question. I typically advise that any type of municipality interested in starting a green bank to help experience and catalyze some of those impacts through private sector finance should think about the economic size of the unit that they're trying to create it around. You really need a critical mass of activity to be able to scale up and to be able to draw in private sector finance. The reality is there's a lot of private sector finance that sits in the wings, and it's because there's not enough scale for them. And so it may be difficult to start a green bank at a small city level, but certainly a medium or a large city level may work. There is a green bank in the District of Columbia, just right next to us. Montgomery County happens to be a relatively large county, and that gets the critical economic value. The other rationale I've seen across the US to establish localized green banks, not at the state level, is if the state appears relatively unfriendly to the moniker of a green bank, which happens in certain places, despite support for perhaps the concept of what they're doing. And so I've seen certain municipalities create green banks around that as well. Certainly with a lot of the money that's flowing down from the Inflation Reduction Act, we've seen a lot more interest at a state level, as well as the municipalities under them to create green banks and similar entities. And I think that's very positive. So I would encourage everybody to leverage that wonderful momentum into creating more green banks.
Fabulous, thank you. David, this question is for you. You talked about these big gaps across the country where there are no heat season disconnection bans. Clearly, a lot of those decisions have to be made at the state level, but is there anything that the administration or Congress can do to help encourage those kinds of policymaking opportunities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Traditionally in our energy system, a lot of the regulation of utilities happens state by state. So naturally you get lots of variation in the outcomes, right? I guess the positive side of that is you get opportunities for experimentation and for innovation, which then can be shared and adopted by other places. But I certainly think in this area of policy, there's room for Congress and for any administration to take action, right? I think clearly we need more uniform policy that protects people across the country. So there's a certain baseline level of protection. And moreover, we need more attention to and recognition to the fact that there are different kinds of utilities that people access their services from. A lot of these state policies that I was talking about really only apply to investor-owned utilities, right? They don't apply to people who might be getting their service from a muni or for a co-op. So I think generally we could use a lot more standardization and kind of raising the bar for what is considered to be protective, right? So that no matter where you live, right, you have protections against disconnections during extreme weather, extreme heat events, right? That shouldn't be a function of geography or accident of which utility you have you're getting your service from. Everybody deserves a baseline level of protection.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Says Kim's data on deaths echoes what we know from Chicago in 1995 and Paris in 2003. But older, single, isolated people are hard to reach with messaging. How can we create messaging to reach them? Kim, I'll start with you with this question, but if anyone else wants to chime in as well, do let me know. So Kim, do you have any thoughts on that?
First, I think some of the efforts that were made in reaction were effective, like announcements using text messaging to, indicate that a heat or weather emergency was approaching. Some of these things helped. We asked that building owners be held accountable, that they contact their tenants, that they, make a cooling center. During COVID, that was difficult. Many people were not at their building. They had no idea what the temperature was inside their building. The tenants had no idea, even if they were feeling hot. They probably had no idea. So I think that's one part of it. Yeah, I'll just leave it there for the moment.
Perfect. Stephen, David, anything to add from your perspectives on that question?
I think just one thing that I would add is that as we finance resiliency hubs through the county, we find it very important to provide that community engagement prior to an event, prior to a heat event, prior to the grid going out. And it's been a requirement from every project that we've done, have clearly posted signage, have community representatives, especially as we work on these in multifamily properties. It may be a little easier to get to those residents specifically, but some of these hubs are meant to be open for the community beyond the building. And so making sure that that education gets out prior to an event has really been key.
Perfect. Anything from you, David?
Yeah, I might just add, one of the motivations for building this disconnections dashboard and for putting up this information about state policies is in reaction to the fact that these are really hard to find, right? Utilities don't always advertise what protections that they make available to individuals. If they do, maybe it's just once a year. So there's a lot more that can be done in this space. We had many students working over many years to compile this information. It's very challenging to access. And I think this is just indicative of these kinds of issues in general, whether it's finding where the nearest cooling center is during a heat event, whether it's finding what kind of financing options might be available to you to improve the energy efficiency or of your home. I think more community engagement largely would be helpful, and particularly targeted at the most vulnerable communities who tend to have the largest challenges finding the programs and policies and efforts to assist them.
Perfect. We might have time for only one or two more questions. Stephen, I think this one is for you. How can we use finance to really promote long-term climate adaptation, not just preparing for the disasters of the past, but looking at the next 20, 30 years and looking at a full life cycle cost of buildings and investment?
Yeah, I think that this is a relatively short answer, and it's very difficult from a financial perspective because it's a type of analysis that you really don't see today. I would say that the data to be able to inform the analyses has gotten much better over the last decade, and it has started to permeate itself into financial disclosures in the correct way to be able to make an impact on those property owners, those developers, those household owners that need to be able to make those decisions. It gives them more access to public data out there, and it gives the type of finance community that they work with access to the type of risks, the climate risks that are associated with the areas that they are living in and working in. So I think it is getting better, and I'm very happy about a lot of the disclosure requirements that have been flowing down across the world. Certainly we could make more progress thinking about the recent SEC disclosure requirements that came through, but these are I think the most key to be able to pass down that analysis of how do you operate long-lived assets in a changing environment.
Thank you so much. Kim, I'm going to give you the last word in less than a minute. Can you please share with me what is the most important thing that you wish policymakers knew about tenants and renters in general as they're thinking about how to protect people from heat?
Well, tenants represent in most communities about 40 to 50% of the population. So it's incredibly critical. You're talking about, most of your constituents do have an issue, and that issue might be utilities, it might be communication. I did want to emphasize there's a need for every there's a need for translation and interpretation, and that's often overlooked. That's happened in a number of public health emergencies here in Oregon, and so lessons learned from that. Communication is really critical, and understanding that tenants don't have the tools to advocate for themselves. It's a very imbalanced picture. where even if a tenant knew what would protect their health, they may not have either the economic tools or the legal tools to enforce it.
On that sobering note, I just want to say thank you again to everyone. I'm going to hand this back off to Morgan. I'm grateful for your time and expertise today. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Juanita, and thank you again for shaping that wonderful panel on behalf of NRDC. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around for the last session of NIHHIS National. My name is Morgan Zabo, and I am the Community Heat and Health Information Coordinator with NOAA. I am thrilled to be moderating our final panel, which is looking at innovative cooling solutions. So throughout the 3-day meeting, many of our panelists have talked about the importance of cooling at different levels, from our homes, our workplaces, our schools, and so much more. And we wanted to give a space to some researchers and practitioners who have implemented some truly innovative cooling solutions in their cities and communities. And we hope that this session inspires communities to think about innovative ways to cool their communities now and in the future. So first up in our session is Martin Hendel, who is speaking to a Paris example, which is a great way also to loop back to the remarks that Jeff Goodell made on day one about how Paris is making some truly innovative strides. So Martin is a researcher at the engineering school SE Paris. He teaches thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, life cycle analysis, and renewable energy production at the undergraduate and graduate levels. He is a researcher in the Climate, Energy, and Urban Environments team of the Interdisciplinary Laboratories of Tomorrow's Energies at the Université de Paris. I want to extend a special thanks to Martin for joining us since he is on a European time zone and it is the evening there. So thanks again for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Morgan. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So I will be talking to you today about an experiment that started some 10 years ago now. I do want to acknowledge my co-authors, which are a mixture of PhD students and other colleagues from university who've contributed to the work that I'll be presenting briefly this afternoon. So just, sorry, next slide. Just as a intro, we're going to be talking about two things. One is going to be the urban heat island, which is, at least in Europe and probably elsewhere, the entry point of the topic of urban heat and urban heat related risks in terms of health. So the thing to take away from this, or if there's anything you should remember, is that urban heat island only looks at air temperature, and we're talking about an air temperature difference between the urban center and a rural area. And so it depends just as well on what's going on in the rural area as what's going on in the city. And when I say it depends on what's going on in the rural area, is that one of the ways to make the UHI change is to have a dry summer as opposed to a wet one, where vegetation will not react the same to the sun and the heat that's being provided by it. This is to be opposed with the next slide, which is going to talk about a notion called pedestrian heat stress, which is the state that we're all familiar with without knowing it. When you are walking down the street on the sunny side of the road and you cross the street from that side to the shady side, air temperature has barely changed, maybe 1 Fahrenheit, half a degree C. You can't really measure that. You can barely tell it yourself. However, you feel way better. And the reason for that is that there's other things that have changed that have nothing to do with air temperature. And those are related to being in the sun, of course. So that would be direct radiation. It can also be in the form of reflected radiation off of reflective surfaces, high albedo surfaces. When you're standing, there isn't much conduction. So you're touching the floor with the ground with your feet. If you've got thick soles, you will not feel that very well, not very much anyway. It depends on wind speed and air temperature, that's convection. And then water is evaporating from you either in the form of sweat or from breathing. And so those are the sweat evaporation and respiration terms. Now, of course, none of this matters if you're wearing a parka and it's plus, in 90 degrees Fahrenheit, right? As opposed to a similar situation would be walking outdoors by -40 with shorts and t-shirt. So clothing matters. And so does the term M here, which is metabolic activity. So have you just woken up from your daily nap, or have you just come out of a marathon? You're not building up this, you haven't built up the same internal heat that you have to regulate. So these are all factors that contribute to strain the body. When I will be talking about the following results, keep in mind that we're going to be looking at these two indicators, urban heat island on the one hand, but without a very strong focus on that, as opposed to pedestrian heat stress. So next slide will give me a little bit of background on the notion of pavement watering. So watering in one form or another is used all around the world, and it has been for centuries, if not millennia. So this is just a small image from Japan, where it's known as Uchimizu. They still have a celebration of Uchimizu, where it has to do with cleaning, it has to do with cooling, it has to do with community values, etc. During my PhD work, I had the luck of stumbling across some old engineering manuals from the early 20th century, where you see pictures like this one and detailed maps of streets and how often they should be watered, depending on weather conditions and stuff like that. It has nothing to do at the time. The motivation is not cooling. It's about keeping dust clouds down, because it's all pavers, all cobblestone. And in between the cobblestone, you've got, dust and grit accumulating. And when that dries off and you get a little gust, you get dust clouds. So they've got these watering maps to keep it clean and comfortable from that perspective. And at the end of these chapters, they say, well, we're going to be able to stop doing that because we've got these new machines that'll clean the streets for us, et cetera, vacuum cleaners and so on. But beware, the locals feel cooled, the fools. Anyway, so 100 years later, we went back to this. So Paris, next slide, please, has this one particularity. It has two water networks. You've got drinking water and you've got non-drinking water, non-potable water. It's the water that they use to clean the streets, to irrigate some of the parks. It's also used for sewer maintenance. Anyway, the question was, following the 2003 heat wave, should we be having urban transpiration? Should we be actively watering in case of a heat wave? These are the threshold values for a heat wave in Paris. And so the question was, well, how much cooling do you actually get and how much water would you be using? So that's what we set out to look into. Next slide will show you a small picture or summary of this instrumentation and stuff that we went into. Unfortunately, I see some of the text is messed up, but that's okay. So we had two sites in Paris, one with a watering hose, one with a street cleaning truck that's been going back and forth all day long, basically at fixed intervals. And we had weather stations on site to characterize what was going on. And these weather stations are not only measuring air temperature, they're measuring a whole bunch of other stuff, which is relevant to that pedestrian heat stress aspect. So next slide, please. So very quickly, some results. So we had thermal indicators as well, which I didn't mention. So we've got on the right here, an infrared thermography of surface temperature, where we've got that watering hose set up. Everything that's blue has been watered all day long. It is now dry. And what we see is we've got a good 10 degrees C, so that's more or less 20 Fahrenheit reduction in surface temperature. So 13 degrees C would be about 20 Fahrenheit when in the sun. On the left here, we have a pavement heat flux meter, which is measuring the heat that's being stored or released by the pavement over the course of the day. In red, we have dry days. In blue, we have watered days. And what we see is that we've got a significant change in the amount of heat being stored by the road. So that's a good thing in terms of how to mitigate urban heat island effect, because one of the problems or one of the sources is stored heat in the urban fabric as opposed to a rural one. Next slide, we'll go into some microclimatic effects. So this is very summarized, but basically we're improving pedestrian heat stress by an order of 3. So that would be about 6 degrees Fahrenheit UTCI. So I won't go into that, but that is a pedestrian heat stress indicator. And so those are those peaks we see in the middle of the day. You can't see my mouse, but it's around in the afternoon between 2 and 6 p.m. And then we do have long-lasting residual effects that last well into the night. So the order of magnitude is about 1/4 degree C. So that would be 1/2 degree Fahrenheit or so. But this is seen as potentially significant given the magnitude of what's been seen in terms of the heat and mortality relations with air temperature for the 2003 heat wave. Now, there's much could be said about that relationship, but it's what is available at the time. Throughout the presentation, there's a number of references that have been made if you want more detail, and then I'm always happy to reach out and discuss it for more. And then the last slide here will be about how much water we're using. And so something that was of concern for the officials in Paris was, well, how much water are we going to be using? How are we going to be discussing this with the public if they ask questions? And what we saw is that when you water the street, about 80% of the water runs off, but it's only providing up to 20% of the actual cooling. And so if you lower it down, which is not that simple on these watering trucks, because they're not made to be adjusting the water flow that well, but or that precisely. But if you did tone it down to just what's being evaporated, you can cut it in half, you can reduce that amount by 5, a factor of 5, so 80%, and still have about almost all the cooling. And so if you optimize it, you get to around 2.3 millimeters per day. And if you just click once, you'll get the animation that will give us the final result. Is that if Paris, what we ended up writing down as a back of the envelope calculation is that if we targeted the 10% hottest public spaces in terms of surface area in Paris, this would work out to about 3 liters per day per person per capita. So 3 liters is less than a gallon. So what I like to say sometimes is that water saving button on the toilet flush, right? So it's not that it's nothing, but it's if you're saving lives or targeting very specific high frequency or high traffic areas, pedestrian traffic areas, it might be worth it. So that's what we did for this field campaign. If we click through the next couple slides, it'll give you a grasp of follow-up work that we've been conducting with the city. So we've done a lot of studies on urban materials in the lab and in the field with the city, including watering, including high albedo pavements, including pervious pavements. We've also looked at building materials, specifically rooftops, combined with watering. The next slide will show further experiments in relation with these cool watered pavements. So this is a European project, LIFE project, which just ended last year, where they were combining new asphalt concrete that had low noise, low rolling noise, and higher water retention, so that the watering effect could last a little longer. We did, because one of the problems is you have to come back quite frequently if you want to keep the pavement wet. But we've also worked on other projects that don't necessarily involve blue infrastructure per se, but green schoolyards or nature-based solutions and so on and so forth. Right now, we're evaluating some urban forests. And then as a last follow-up work that we did, and then I presented in New York back in 2018, was how to strategize. Where do you start with urban cooling techniques? And so the initial question was, where do we start watering, or where should we be targeting for watering? And so this raises a couple of questions. One is, where are the heat wave or the heat vulnerable people? Where can we find them? Keep in mind that these cooling techniques in public spaces, we're not touching the buildings, right? They're efficient outdoors, but they don't necessarily affect indoor comfort at all. So we're looking at pedestrian vulnerability. So we're looking for high traffic areas or areas that are in maybe lower traffic, but in vulnerable communities. So that's what's on the bottom. And then the top here is, where can watering actually make a difference? Of course, so then you got to look at other parameters which are more physically based. So it's, where's the sun, where's there low vegetation, where are the materials of the pavement poorly designed or accumulating heat, so that watering can actually make a difference. So I'm going to end it here because I think I'm through with the time if I haven't gone over. Please don't hesitate to shoot an email or anything if you want to reach out and discuss it further. And thanks again.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Blue infrastructure is not necessarily something that is talked about a lot in the US, so I'm really glad that we got to hear your perspective on a case study of how this can be effective. So thank you again. So now we are headed back to the US to hear from Michelle Litwin. Michelle is a dynamic leader from West Virginia and is passionate about urban heat and climate resilience. As a heat response program manager for Phoenix, she coordinates the city departments and partners to enhance cooling resources, awareness, and policies. She develops programs safeguarding vulnerable populations from extreme heat. Michelle's commitment extends beyond work as she advocates tirelessly for her community, ensuring access and resources for all. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here today and chat with you all. I understand that what we discussed today may vary in applicability based on your jurisdiction and regulations and context in that area, but I'm excited and hopeful that we can navigate that together. I'd also like to note that we are trying to get better at evaluation here, and we really do think that it's important to learn what is working and why. The better we evaluate, the better we can respond to heat challenges. I hope that today's discussion sparks some food for thought, and looking forward to diving in and coming away with some fresh perspectives together. Next slide, please. To give you a few examples of specific actions in the plan, summer 2023 saw significant achievements for our We're Cool outreach program. Engagements included 8,300 contacts to different individuals. Staff and volunteer hours surged over 40% to 1,700 hours. We included ASU nursing students and enhanced medical services to our outreach programs. Emergency response efforts also contributed to 381 hours to sustain cooling center hours during record-breaking heat. Next, please. To quickly give a bit of context to the big picture around heat response here in Phoenix, and I apologize, I think I put these slides out of order here. The office has finalized its third heat response plan. It comprises of 39 specific actions grouped into 9 overarching strategies, as you can see on the slide here. We include first responders, leveraging data, public drinking water, cool and safe homes, cool and safe mobility and recreation, heat safety for workers, community engagement, and collaboration across city departments. Today's session, I would like to zero in on one crucial aspect though, cool spaces. Next slide, please. I'd also like to continue and highlight a little bit more about what we were able to do in the summer of 2023. We were awarded $384,000 in American Rescue Plan Act funding, which went to support 19 local organizations within our heat relief network, which I will talk about on the next slide. The assistance reached over 28,000 individuals with heat response supplies, and an additional 16,000 received comprehensive support, including case management and respite. Through the city's water distribution program, we distributed over 400,000 water bottles to local entities. On this slide, I'd like to share a little bit of context about our regional heat relief network, which I mentioned, to set the stage for specific cool space interventions that I will discuss later. Established in 2006 by MAG, the Maricopa County Association of Governments, the Heat Relief Network coordinates hydration stations, cooling centers, and respite centers. For context, hydration stations are indoor and outdoor locations where people can retrieve water. Cooling centers are indoor conditioned areas that offer hydration. Respite centers are indoor conditioned locations that offer hydration and areas for uninterrupted rest. The city contributes more than 60 facilities to these efforts as a part of a network of 200 or more. Next slide, please. I'd like to take a moment to review challenges within the heat relief network, including addressing the needs over 1,000+ unsheltered people experiencing homelessness near our major human services hub in downtown Phoenix called the Key Campus. Dealing with complexities such as possessions, pets, substance-related issues, navigating low trust, confidence, and relationships in certain institutions, as well as the individuals that face prohibitions from accessing specific facilities. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to take a moment to review what heat relief options were available around the Key Campus before we established the intervention. I'd like to note that there were some options in this area, as you can see on this slide, but there were limitations to who could access them and how well they worked. Next slide, please. Love how that came out. Next slide is after the intervention. As mentioned, back one, please. Thank you. At this point in the summer, we were seeing anywhere between 900 to 1,000 people experiencing homelessness around the Key Campus. As someone who is in the area daily, firsthand and using firsthand information from our Office of Homeless Solutions, we selected the area near several shelters, the SAC food lunch locations, and the Key Campus, with the idea, and I said this multiple times throughout the summer, that we want to meet people where they are and bring the relief to them. Next slide, please. In late June and early July, we began seeing hints of a forecast that was beyond the normal excessive heat we'd seen in Phoenix before. And there were indicators that the heat was going to be there to stay. We began having meetings with several departments, which included our Office of Emergency Management, Transit Department, Fire, PD, Public Health, and several other departments within the city. On July 19th, we deployed the temporary cooling opportunity following a previous approach that we had done in past summers. The bus was operational July 19th to September 4th and was available from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. to address the hottest periods of the day. On average, about 210 visitors were on the bus per day, and we saw a total of 5,000 visits throughout the summer. Cold water, security, and case management were provided on the bus as well. I would like to acknowledge that this is a stopgap measure. It is not deemed the best strategy. We acknowledge that there are better, more sustainable long-term solutions like formal cooling spaces. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge personally the vibe that I experienced when I went on the bus. There were multiple times when I would go on the bus to bring water or ice to replenish. And there was usually this sense of calm and peace and people expressing gratitude to have the space to get cool water, to rest, and be near their possessions. Next slide, please. We are eager to hear your thoughts on evaluation. While it was not designed as a scientific experiment, we do believe that this intervention lends itself well to evaluation. A defined audience and geographic scope offers a better chance for evaluation compared to others, like our libraries, which act as cooling centers, where we do not regularly or routinely ask people why they are there. Next slide, please. To set up the evaluation, let's compare some weather and health data from the periods before and after the bus were deployed. The first 3 columns show the overlapping 3, 2, and 1 week periods before deployment, and the next 3 columns show the overlapping 1, 2, and 3 weeks after. Scanning the first row, you'll see temperatures were just as hot or even hotter in the period post-deployment. We also saw roughly the same number of heat warning days pre and post. And when we look at the citywide 911 call data, we see there were more calls in the 1, 2, and 3 week periods after the bus was deployed than before. So when we think about what was happening in general in the city at this period of time, it seems reasonable to us to assume that heat-related 911 calls in the immediate proximity of the bus deployment should have been higher than post-deployment period where there was no intervention. It was hotter, and we were seeing worse public health indicators across the city. Next slide, please. So what did we see where the bus was deployed? Counts of 911 calls in the quarter-mile area around the bus are in the top row there. And again, for those overlapping 1, 2, and 3 week periods. You can see that in terms of the raw numbers, we actually saw fewer cases post-deployment in those time periods, opposite of what we would have expected based on the citywide patterns and talked about in the previous slide. And if we make the assumption that calls in this area would have trended similarly to the citywide data, that's expected calls row, we see that there was an even greater reduction. Focusing on the far right column for the first 3 weeks after the bus was deployed, we saw 15 heat-related 911 calls in the immediate area versus an expected count of about 25. Our best estimate is that we avoided about 10 heat-related 911 calls in the immediate area, which translates to about 40% call reduction. Next slide, please. With those estimates of avoided 911 calls, we are well positioned to perform at least a crude benefit cost analysis for this intervention in terms of dollars. We have good data about the direct cost of this intervention in terms of fuel, staffing costs, and can make some reasonably informed estimates about some real staff time and resources allocated to support the bus. All in all, this was about $50,000. This was about a $50,000 project. So how about those benefits? Well, let's start and what we just calculated, those 10 avoided 911 calls. We estimate the cost of each of those calls to be about $5,000. So that already gives us a $50,000 benefit, 10 times 5,000, and such the intervention appears to be at worst a break-even proposition. But we think it's fair to estimate that there were additional benefits. We looked at historical data to get a sense of the typical ratio between 911 calls, which we directly measured, and heat-related hospitalizations and fatalities, which we did not measure. If those historical ratios held true in this environment, our conservative estimates is that there would have been 3 avoided hospitalizations over a 3-week period and 1/10 of 1 avoided fatality. You can see our benefit estimates for those outcomes, which begin to add up to a pretty significant number. Let me add one more thing to think about when it comes to our calculation. Going back to something I said early in the presentation about what it was really like on the bus. People were safe. They were comfortable. They were resting. They were less anxious and less worried. They were enjoying themselves and holding conversations with others. Those are real societal benefits too. And our team does not have any sense about how to value that. But to us, it does feel like a very important part of a calculation. And we should try and be figuring out how to quantify that as a HUE community as a part of our practice. Next slide, please. Our future efforts include a broader set of 911 calls and medical data integration, implementation of exposure response regression model for refined benefit estimates, expansion of an IMT structure, and introduction of extended and overnight cooling and navigation centers. I would like to express my gratitude to stakeholders who continue to prioritize heat relief and support ongoing internal and external endeavors. We'd also like to thank members of the CDC Brace Heat Community of Practice who provided feedback on a first draft of this evaluation. And we invite interested collaborators to join us for continued thinking and analysis. I appreciate your time for listening. Thank you.
Michelle, thank you so much for giving us that overview of such an innovative solution that was able to help give thousands of people relief in Phoenix last summer. And you're getting a lot of positive chats coming in about the project too. So for our last presentation of this meeting, we are headed a little east for a case study in Texas from Kevin Lanza. Kevin is an assistant professor at UT Health Houston School of Public Health. His research explores the relations between environment, health, and well-being through a social equity lens, with a focus on extreme heat and physical activity of children and other populations disproportionately impacted by heat. He currently serves on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Board of Scientific Counselors and Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Morgan, for the kind introduction, and I'm excited to join Martin Hendel and Michelle Litwin on this panel of this last session. So, hi everyone, thanks for joining. And today we're going to talk about cooling solutions at bus stops, in particular, 2 different case studies from cities in Texas. I'll start with Austin, Texas, where I'm located, and then we're also going to talk about a cooling strategy in Houston. And so this image here is in Houston, Texas, and this is a familiar image I suspect most of you have seen if you live in a place with public transit, where a resident is waiting not necessarily at a designed bus stop or that has a shelter or any type of shade, but rather finding their own shade to feel comfortable in those temperatures. Next slide. So across the US and a few cities outside the US, NIHHIS has led different urban heat island mapping campaigns to measure, as Martin showed in his presentation, this urban heat island intensity. And so this is looking at air temperature, where different community residents drove their personal vehicles around a portion of Austin on one day on August 7th, 2020, and they measured air temperature and relative humidity every 1 second. And from where they drove, the NIHHIS team was then able to model for us estimated air temperatures across the entire portion or study area. And what you can see in this image on the right-hand side is the urban heat island intensity, how it's distributed unequally, but that unequal distribution is also inequitable in that the northwest portion of the study area has the highest temperatures during the morning as measured, and they were about 6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the cooler areas. We then decided to focus on that northwest portion, which happened to be a Latino economically disadvantaged community, to ask them their experience with extreme heat, how it affects them, and then also what they would like to see in terms of environmental solutions to mitigate these high temperatures in their area. And one piece that did come up through those interviews was the effect of heat on their active travel behavior, such as using public transit. As we've learned in the United States, about 2/3 of all public transit users, so think about buses and light rail, they tend to walk to get to and from the bus stop or station. And so that exposes them to whatever temperatures are in their surroundings. Next slide. So with that community, that northwest portion of Austin in the last slide, we conducted semi-structured qualitative interviews with 18 Latino and Black adults, 17 of the 18 of which were identified as female and had children in Austin, Texas. So we asked them their experience with extreme heat, and we asked them for their recommended adaptation strategies. And I think this quote resonates well with this type of work. Nothing about us without us is for us, is in that those that are impacted by a given climate stressor need to be meaningfully involved in not only identifying the issue, but co-developing that given solution. And so the first Latina woman, she mentioned, sometimes bus stops are very far away and don't have shade to look forward to. The buses were very late. If you miss one, you have to wait for the other, 30 or 40 minutes, depending on the route. So 4 things kind of come out to me when I read this quote. One is the stops are far away. So that's if people are walking to get to the bus stop, that's quite a bit of heat exposure. And then when you actually get to that intermediate destination, the bus stop, you don't have shade when you're there. The buses were very late, so that gets at this delay leads to a continued exposure to the extreme heat. And if you miss one, you have to wait for another 30 or 40 minutes. So that gets at the headway, or how often buses are arriving. And that again continues that exposure to these uncomfortable and potentially unsafe conditions. Second quote, there were mothers who were down here to wait for their children to get out of the buses, and there was a tree, and the mothers would sit under the tree because there was shade while they were waiting. Now I see they are in the sun waiting for their children. Well, no, I don't think that's right. So here you see there was respite from the heat, being a tree shade near a bus stop that multiple individuals were taking advantage of, yet it sounds like it was taken away at a given point, and this led to exposure. Last quote, well, it's not easy for people who are walking. I think we need a little more shade on the streets because there are places where there are no trees. So this gets at not only the bus stop itself, but the route to get there. And we need to make sure those are comfortable. Next slide. So now shifting gears a little, but staying in Austin, we then conducted a study on do bus stop shelters and trees that are nearby bus stops, do they impact the effect of extreme heat on bus ridership? So kind of the hypothesis here was if you had a bus stop shelter, so that artificial structure above a bus stop, or a tree nearby, it would have a protective effect on ridership on an extreme heat day. And so here you see two different images of bus stops in Austin. I actually used to take these on my commute. On the left-hand side, you don't see much. You do see a trash can, a sign, a seat. On the right-hand side, you see shade. You see two different artificial shade structures, and also you see people. Next slide. So just continuing with that study, the outcome that we looked at was the total number of bus boardings during the hottest part of the day, 1 to 6 p.m. each day per bus stop. There's about 2,300 bus stops in Austin, of which about 1/3 of them had bus stop shelters, those artificial shade structures. In terms of exposure variables, we looked at the daily maximum air temperature. We defined a hot day based on definitions from the literature and relative to temperature conditions here. We looked at the presence of a bus stop shelter. Was there one? Was there not one? And the amount of tree canopy surrounding a bus stop, which we define that percentage of tree canopy based on what one could get to within about a 20-second walk. So what we found from regression modeling is that higher temperatures did lead to lower ridership levels, which could get at, well, it's uncomfortable. People don't want to be traveling when it's so hot in Austin, which is a really warm climate. Second, we found that trees at bus stops, but not shelters, moderated the effect of hot days on ridership. So this means that trees have a slight protective effect on ridership levels. These results don't mean we're canceling the idea of bus stop shelters. Really, it might so get at the population using the bus system in Austin, which, looking at the data from the US Census, is majority lower income individuals, and a fifth of which don't have vehicles of their own. So there may be some level of transit dependency that, regardless of the weather conditions, they have to use the bus to get to or from where they want to go. And so because of that, we want to make these safe places that people can use. Next slide. Okay, so now we talked about Austin. We're going to shift gears now to Houston. And so this was a study, a pilot study conducted by two investigative reporters at Houston Public Media at the time, Sarah Ernst and Katie Watkins, and it's called Hot Stops, How Houston Bus Stops Get Dangerously Hot. And I had the good fortune to partner with them on designing and conducting this study. Next slide. So in Houston, who rides the bus? About 49 million bus boardings in 2023, which is around what, 4 million or so a year, and a month. And what you can see from these 2017 data are different kind of characteristics of public transit users in the Houston area. So going left to right, we see that about 2/3 of those who do use public transit in Houston are using the bus. It's a majority lower income individuals. About 70% identify as African American or Hispanic or Latino. Most people who are using public transit are using it often, like they're frequent chronic users. And then lastly, about almost 80% are walking to get to and from the transit systems. Next slide. And so in this study, what did we do? We looked at 21 different bus stops in Houston during the summer, 2 summer months, July and August of last year. And we looked at 2 times a day, noon, so kind of that lunch hour, plus rush hour on the afternoon, 4 to 6 p.m. We measured heat stress, which there are literally hundreds of heat stress metrics. This one, what we used was called wet bulb globe temperature, or WBGT, which is composed of air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation. And so what you can see in the top right image here are different general thresholds for WBGT. And so it shows 3 different regions of the US. Houston, Texas is in region 3. So it shows different thresholds of threat level for different WBGT values. So note that these don't directly correspond to air temperature values because of these 3 other components that are included within this metric. So anything 90 and above is an extreme threat to health. And so how do we measure WBGT? We use this Quest Temp 15 WBGT air heat stress monitor. You can see that in each of the images in the bottom right. And it was put on a stand that was about 3 feet high, which equated to about where people would maybe sitting level if you were at a bus stop. And then at each of these 21 bus stops, we took 3 measurements per location per stop. So that bottom right image shows you if there was a bus stop shelter, the 3 different locations, we would be taking 3 measurements each at, and then we would average any of those given 3 measurements. If it was a bus stop without a shelter but had tree shade, we would just do 2 types of locations, under the tree shade and then under the bus, or and not under the tree shade at that given bus stop. Next slide. So what did we find across these 21 bus stops, these multiple measurements per day, and these different typologies of bus stops? Well, we found that wet bulb globe temperature was more than 2 times lower under tree shade than shelters at bus stops on average. So 5.6 degrees wet bulb globe temperature versus 2.6 degrees wet bulb globe temperature. Next slide. And then alarmingly, in 16% of cases, we saw that WBGT, wet bulb globe temperature, was higher under shelters than standing outside in direct sunlight at bus stops. That's illustrated in the left-hand picture, where it's about, 6 degrees wet bulb globe temperature warmer within the bus stop shelter than outside of the shelter. That's alarming, that's surprising. And but then when you look at the design of the shelter, it may not be so, where you see that it has 3 glass panels where that more or less acts like a convective oven and heats up whatever is inside of that space. And that's something that we could work on as an environmental intervention. So here's a quote from one of the residents. "We look for shade nearby. We don't go inside the bus shelter because it feels steamy there." Next. And so looking forward, when the environment isn't conducive to tree planting, such as what you see in the left-hand image in Houston, there may be other solutions available, because we do know that trees take quite a bit of time to grow and they take a lot of effort to maintain. And so when you're planting a tree, typically you plant a smaller tree, right, a sapling, and you have to wait for that to grow as the ecosystem services grow, right? And then who's taking that into account? What is under the surface that is impacting its planting and its health? So on the right-hand side, we see in the city of Tempe, Arizona, right next to Phoenix, where Michelle's located, a different type of bus stop shelter design, where you see seating at different places around the bus stop shelter that are all covered by shade, depending on where the sun is, based on time of day. And so I think that's a fantastic opportunity. And what better than to not only have trees, but also have more advanced bus stop shelters with heat in mind. Next slide. And so just in conclusion, heat affects everyone, okay? Yet heat impacts the health and well-being of some more than others. Tree shade at bus stops has been shown to protect against ridership losses on hot days. On average, tree shade is 2 times more effective at lowering heat stress than bus shelters, at least in our preliminary analysis. And then lastly, shelter design can actually lead to higher heat stress than no shelter at all at given bus stops. Next slide. Well, oh, that turned out fun. Okay, so this is me saying thank you to the collaborators here, that without them, this work wouldn't have been possible. This is a mix of Houston Public Media, different investigators at different universities, and local nonprofits and city government folks. Thank you. Next slide. All right, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you all have, and thank you all for joining the NIHHIS national meeting.
Kevin, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. There was so much great stuff shared, and I think you're getting some more great chat going on for your work. So thank you so much. And if there's any questions that you want to address, you're able to in the Q&A. But I now see that we are at 3:45, and so this concludes the last session of NIHIS National. So I'm going to turn it over to the co-chairs, but thank you again so much to the fantastic presenters in that session. Over to you, Paul, and the rest.
Thanks, Morgan. And I think we're going to start with Julie for some closing remarks. Is that right? Or Nick?
I just wanted to say thank you for 3 days of really exceptional presentations, and wanted to thank all of the keynotes, the panelists, and all of the people who did all the work to make it happen. Over to you, Julie.
All right, so I think, we have a lot of folks to thank here. I want to thank the moderators and facilitators. Is Kim on too? Let me just make sure.
Yes, I'm here.
All right, so Kim, I think I'm going to close it out. Do you want to say a few words? I know you had a few things as well and a few folks to thank. So do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So I want to say it's bittersweet that we're concluding another NIHIS National and our third day of this year's NIHIS National. Today really hit home some of the difficult situations disproportionately impacted groups face when it comes to heat, and that's from the real possibility of not being able to keep cool due to the cost of utilities or even eviction, depending on what's included in the rent, to the grave danger of power outages and electricity dependent medical equipment. And I did want to point out, something that Kim McCarty said. The utility assistance is a matter of human dignity, and I think that a lot of the presentations today really, it comes back down to not just human dignity, but I'll say human rights to shelter, and that includes a cool shelter, not just a shelter keeping you out of the rain. And we also saw solutions that can be used to help people to get relief from heat, from utility assistance to some of the infrastructure adjustments that were just mentioned, especially regarding the bus shelters. So on that note, we're still, heat is dangerous, but it is also something that we are all working on from a national, regional, state, local level, tribal, territorial, and also international scales. And I hope that invigorates people that while we are dealing with a very serious topic, there's a lot going on and there's more to do, and we're all going to make a difference by working together. So a couple of announcements. April 22nd, that's Monday, is Earth Day. There'll be lots of announcements coming up, like the Weather Service heat risk tools rolling out with a joint webinar with CDC and the Weather Service. The social media heat safety campaign kicks off the very next week on April 29th through May 3rd. So hashtag NIHHIS, hashtag heat safety. And I just want to make sure that everybody is aware that they can be more engaged with NIHHIS. And actually at that point, that's where I'm turning it over to Julie to just explain more and how can we be more engaged.
Julie, we can't hear you. Nope, you're still showing as on mute. Unless it's on my side. You guys can't hear Julie? Well, I can give a couple of additional thank yous as we see if Julie can get that mic fixed. First, I really want to thank my colleagues at CDC in our Division of Environmental Health Science and Practice who run NIHHIS. That's the platform we're using for this. We've used it in previous years, and I just want to thank them for their planning expertise and their countless hours of behind the scenes work to ensure that the platform ran smoothly. I also want to thank the clinicians that participated in our panel yesterday. I know that being able to bridge between healthcare and public health is a big part of what we're trying to do. And then finally, I want to thank everyone who is here, who is participating for the work that done and will do to prevent heat-related illness and death. It really is a broad collaborative effort, and we're glad to have so many committed and passionate colleagues. So let's see if Julie's sound is working. Okay, we might have lost Julie right at the end, so I can try to cover for what I knew she was going to say, and Kim, if you want to jump in, or others. I think one other group to really thank is the planning committee that helped to put this together. It was a lot of work over many months. I know you've seen Morgan on here. She really did a huge amount of work on this. Claudia Brown from CDC, Lauren also with NIHHIS. There's a whole planning committee of people. We had communication staff from both NOAA and CDC involved, and they were meeting daily at some points and collecting setting up speakers, collecting PowerPoint presentations from dozens of people, just working tirelessly to pull this meeting off. So a massive thank you to them. This absolutely would not have happened without you.
And Paul, while you're thanking everyone, I want to say thank you to our ASL interpreters. I know that with timed presentations, people tend to speak fast. So amazing work on their part, and sorry for any exhaustion we may cause.
All right. Well, I think Julie's microphone's not coming back, but that's fine. So we will close this out with. Do we want to go through a couple of those reminders? I'm happy to do that if we want to. Yeah. Could you go back one? There we go. So just a reminder that we do have the Heat Safety Awareness social media campaign coming up. This was mentioned earlier, but here are the specific dates as well as the topic areas. So please do participate with that in your organization. Share the hashtags, do whatever you normally do on social media, share it with your comms campaign. And then on the next slide, we have an update on the NOAA Urban Heat Island mapping campaigns. So these new locations were mentioned earlier in our keynote from the NOAA administrator, but we just wanted to highlight that this is kicking off again. This has gone on for several years and just a fantastic program that NOAA has. And then finally on the next slide, to please fill out the post-meeting survey by April 25th. We want to make sure that these meetings are useful for everyone that's attending. And we really do, take what's in those surveys and use it to adjust what we're doing and future meetings. Morgan, will that survey be shared via email?
Yes, we're also, I'm going to share it via email as well, and it will be posted on heat.gov. And I do want to note that the meeting recordings are now available on heat.gov.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you again, everyone. That concludes the NIHHIS National Meeting, and thank you all for attending.
Julie, no, we still can't hear you. What you can do possibly is click on the up arrow next to the mute button and leave computer audio, and then rejoin computer audio. It's remote possibility. The better bet is just getting out and getting all the way back in. Do you guys want me to go ahead and end the meeting now?
Yeah,
Leave
I
that
think
more.
we
Yeah.
should, right?
Yeah,
All
I
right.
think so.
Thanks,
Thanks again,
Okay.
everyone. We did it. Yay, year 3.
Right.
Thanks, everyone.
If I ever meet Morgan in person, I'm gonna get her to sign an autograph.
And thank you, Jonathan. We couldn't have done it without you.
Alrighty, bye guys.